The alarms blared, piercing through the cold metal corridors of Elysium. Commander Kael Voss stood in the dimly lit command center, his breath visible in the frosty air. The holographic display flickered, casting eerie shadows across his face. A single line of text pulsed on the screen. "They're coming. Prepare for war." His heart pounded as the station trembled violently, the sound of distant explosions reverberating through the hull. "Status report," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. A young officer, her hands shaking, glanced up from her console. "Unknown signatures approaching fast, Commander. They're not from Earth." Kael clenched his fists, his mind racing. Earth was a wasteland below, its surface scorched and lifeless. There was no help coming, no reinforcements, just them, the last remnants of humanity, and whatever was out there, closing in. The station shuddered again, louder this time, and the lights flickered. Kael's voice was steady but urgent. "Seal all sectors. Arm the defense turrets. We hold this station no matter what." Outside the observation window, streaks of light flashed across the void, growing brighter with every second. Whatever was coming, it wasn't stopping. And neither would they. The command center buzzed with frantic activity, officers darting between consoles as the station groaned under the strain. Kael's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "All hands, report to battle stations. We don't have the luxury of panic. Not now." He turned to face the assembled crew, their faces pale but determined. "Listen up," he began, his tone steady but laced with urgency. "Our resources are stretched thin. Power reserves at 40%. Food stocks barely enough for 2 weeks. And if that wasn't enough, we're up against an enemy we don't even understand. The Void, whatever they are relentless, and they're coming for us." Lieutenant Mara Reyes stepped forward, her dark eyes blazing with a mix of fear and defiance. "Commander, with all due respect, we deserve to know more. What are we facing? Where did they come from? And why now?" Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered. Kael hesitated, the weight of her questions pressing down on him. He knew she was right, they all deserved answers, but the truth was as elusive as the enemy itself. "The Void," he said slowly, "isn't just a threat, it's a mystery. They don't communicate, they don't negotiate, they just consume every ship, every colony they've encountered, gone without a trace, and now they've found us." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "We're not just fighting for Elysium, we're fighting for the survival of our species. If we fail here, humanity dies." "Right here, right now." Mara crossed her arms, her frustration simmering. "And what's the plan, Commander? Hold the line with what? Half-powered shields and a handful of turrets." "We're outmatched and you know it." Kael's jaw tightened, but he met her challenge head on. "You're right, we are outmatched, but we're not out of options. We've got ingenuity, we've got resolve, and we've got each other. The moment we stop believing in that, we've already lost." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I need you, Mara. I need all of you. This station is the last bastion of humanity. If we fall, there's nothing left." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Outside, the station's shields flickered, their faint blue glow illuminating the void beyond. The Void's ships were closer now, their dark, angular forms slicing through the blackness like predators stalking their prey. Kael turned back to the holographic display, his hands gripping the edge of the console. "Prepare for impact," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "We hold the line, or humanity dies here." Mara exhaled sharply, her shoulders squaring as she nodded. "Understood, Commander, but when this is over, we're going to need answers." Kael didn't respond, his focus locked on the approaching threat. The crew scrambled to their posts, the station's systems humming as they strained under the weight of what was to come. The flickering shields were a grim reminder of their vulnerability, but also a beacon of defiance. They were the last hope, the final stand, and as the void closed in, Kael knew one thing for certain: they would fight, not because they believed they could win, but because they had no other choice. The darkness beyond the station's observation window seemed to ripple, as though the void itself were alive. Then, without warning, a massive shape emerged, its black hull glinting faintly in the dim starlight. The void warship was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, a jagged, angular behemoth, bristling with weapons that pulsed with an unnatural, sickly green light. Its presence was suffocating, as if it had drained the very life from the space around it. Kael's eyes narrowed as he studied the holographic display, his mind racing. "Helm, evasive maneuvers now," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The station groaned in protest, its aging engines struggling to respond. The deck tilted sharply, throwing several crew members off balance. Alarms wailed as the void warship locked onto their position, its movements eerily precise, like a predator circling its prey. Mara gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles white. "Commander, we can't outrun them. The engines are failing. We're sitting ducks out here." Kael's jaw tightened, his mind racing through their dwindling options. He glanced at the holographic readout, the void warship's trajectory flashing red as it closed the distance. "Divert all power to the shields," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll have to hold them off until we can regroup." But before the order could be fully executed, the void warship unleashed its first barrage. Streaks of plasma fire erupted from its weapons, cutting through the void with terrifying speed. The station's shields flickered and buckled under the assault, their faint blue glow sputtering like a dying flame. A deafening explosion rocked the station as the plasma fire tore through the outer hull, sending debris spiraling into the void. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder as the station's life support systems struggled to compensate. Mara cursed under her breath, her hands flying across her console in a desperate attempt to stabilize the damage. "Hull breach in sectors 7 and 8. We're losing pressure sealing bulkheads now." Her voice was sharp, but beneath the urgency was a flicker of fear. They all felt it, the creeping dread that this might be the end. Kael's eyes darted to the observation window, where the void warship loomed larger than ever. Its weapons were charging again, the sickly green light growing brighter with each passing second. "Arm all defense turrets," he commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Target their weapons array. If we can disable it, we might stand a chance." The crew sprang into action, their movements frantic but deliberate. The station's turrets whirred to life, their barrels swiveling to lock onto the void warship. Beams of concentrated energy lanced out, striking the enemy vessel's hull, but the void warship's defenses were formidable. Its armor absorbed the attacks with little more than a faint ripple, as if mocking their efforts. Mara's voice broke through the tension, her tone laced with desperation. "Commander, the turrets aren't enough. We need another plan, and fast." Kael's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and instinct. "Prepare the ion cannon," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We've got one shot. Make it count." The ion cannon was their last hope, a weapon of immense power, capable of delivering a crippling blow. But it was also a weapon of last resort, draining the station's already depleted power reserves. As the crew scrambled to prepare the cannon, Kael's gaze remained fixed on the Void warship. Its weapons were fully charged now, the green light nearly blinding. The station shuddered violently as another barrage of plasma fire struck, the shields finally collapsing under the relentless assault. The air grew thin, and the temperature dropped further, frost forming on the edges of the consoles. Kael clenched his fists, his breath visible in the freezing air. Fire the ion cannon. Now, a blinding beam of energy erupted from the station, streaking toward the Void warship with unerring precision. For a moment, the darkness of space was illuminated, the beam striking the enemy vessel's hull with a deafening crack. The Void warship shuddered, its weapons flickering as its systems faltered. But it wasn't enough. The warship's lights dimmed, but it didn't stop. It continued its relentless advance, its weapons slowly powering up once more. Mara's voice was barely above a whisper, her words heavy with dread. "Commander, what do we do now?" Kael's eyes hardened, his resolve unshaken. "We fight," he said simply. "Until the last breath, until the last drop of power, we fight." The station groaned under the weight of its own wounds, the sound of metal straining against the void. Kael adjusted the rebreather strapped to his face, the cold air biting at his lungs as he led his team through the dim, sparking corridors toward the breach in the hull. The damage was worse than he'd feared, gaping holes torn into the station's outer layers, exposing the crew to the unforgiving vacuum of space. Frost coated the walls, and the faint hiss of escaping air was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "Seal suits tight," Kael ordered, his voice muffled by the rebreather but no less commanding. "We've got one shot at this. If we don't patch those breaches, we're dead in the water." The team moved quickly, their boots clanging against the metal floor as they hauled welding gear and reinforced plating. Kael's mind raced, calculating the time they had before the Void's next attack. But as they approached the breach, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each step. He froze, his hand shooting up to signal the others to stop. "Listen," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. "Something's coming." Before anyone could react, the ceiling above them exploded in a shower of sparks. Dark, insect-like shapes poured through the gap, boarding drones, their metallic bodies gleaming in the flickering light. Kael's heart pounded as he raised his weapon, the first shots ringing out in the cramped corridor. "Fall back, cover the breach," he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. The firefight was frantic, the narrow space turning into a deadly choke point. The drones moved with terrifying precision, their movements unnervingly fluid for machines. Kael's team fought with everything they had, but the drones kept coming, their sheer numbers overwhelming. A burst of plasma fire struck one of Kael's team members, sending them sprawling to the ground. Kael cursed, dragging them to cover as the others laid down suppressive fire. Mara's voice crackled over the comms, her tone urgent. "Commander, we've got a bigger problem. The power grid's failing. If we don't stabilize it, we're looking at a total blackout." Kael's jaw tightened as he fired another burst, the drone in front of him crumpling to the ground. "Understood. Hold the line here. I'll handle the grid." But as he turned to go, Mara's voice stopped him. "Wait, there's something else. I've been analyzing the drone's code. There's a signal embedded in it. It's strange, it's not just a command structure. It's repeating a message." Kael's brow furrowed. "A message? What does it say?" Mara hesitated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's repeating coordinates, and a single word. Remember." "This isn't just an attack, Kael, it's a message. But from who, or what?" The words sent a chill down Kael's spine, colder than the freezing air around him. He glanced at the drones still pouring into the corridor, their movements almost purposeful. "Keep digging," he said, his voice low. "If there's a message in there, we need to know what it means. But first, we've got to keep this station in one piece." The sound of another explosion shook the corridor, the lights flickering ominously. Kael's team was barely holding the line, their ammo running low and their energy fading. He knew they couldn't last much longer. "Fall back to the power grid," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of desperation. "We'll make our stand there. And Mara, whatever you're doing, do it fast. We're running out of time." As the team retreated, the drones followed, their relentless advance unyielding. The station's power grid loomed ahead, its flickering lights a grim reminder of their dwindling options. Kael's mind raced, torn between the immediate threat of the drones and the unsettling mystery of the signal. Whatever the void was trying to tell them, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight for answers, and if they failed, humanity's last hope would die in the dark. The corridor leading to Aegis Core was eerily silent, the only sound the rhythmic clang of Kael's boots against the metal floor. The station's central AI, Aegis, was their last hope for answers, or so he hoped. The glowing blue interface of the AI's chamber pulsed faintly as he approached, its light casting long shadows across the room. Kael's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and demanding. "Aegis, I need answers. What do you know about the void? And don't give me cryptic nonsense, we're out of time." The AI's voice was calm, almost too calm, as it responded. "Commander Voss, your query is registered. However, the information you seek is classified under Protocol Omega. Access requires Level 10 clearance." Kael's fist slammed against the console, the sound echoing through the chamber. "Protocol Omega, clearance. We're under attack, Aegis. Humanity's last outpost is crumbling, and you're worried about clearance levels. Override the protocols now." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the glow of the interface intensified, and Aegis' tone shifted, less mechanical, more human. "Very well, Commander. What I am about to reveal has been suppressed for centuries. The void is not a new threat. It is an ancient one. A war was fought long ago, a war humanity chose to forget." Kael's breath caught in his throat. "A war? What are you talking about?" Aegis' holographic display flickered to life, projecting fragmented images of a conflict that seemed impossible. Massive ships, unlike anything Kael had ever seen, clashed in the void. Cities burned on distant planets, their skies darkened by the shadows of void warships. "This was the first contact war," Aegis explained, "a conflict so devastating that it nearly eradicated humanity. To ensure survival, the decision was made to erase all records of the war, to bury the truth so deep that even we would forget." Kael's mind reeled, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Why would they do that?" "Because the void does not simply destroy," Aegis replied. "It consumes, it erases. It seeks to obliterate all traces of its enemies, leaving no memory, no history, nothing to prove they ever existed. Humanity's leaders believed that by erasing the war, they could hide from the void. But it was only a matter of time before it found us again. The pieces began to fall into place, a cold dread settling in Kael's chest. The signal Mara found, remember. It's not a message from the void. It's a warning from us, from the past." "Correct," Aegis confirmed. "The station's archives contain fragments of the truth, records of the war, of the weapons used to fight it, of the strategies that kept humanity alive. But accessing them will not be easy. The void knows where we are, Commander, and it will stop at nothing to ensure those archives are destroyed." Kael's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. Then we'll get to them first. If those archives hold the key to humanity's survival, we'll protect them at all costs. Aegis' voice grew quieter, almost summer. Be warned, Commander. The truth you seek may be more dangerous than the void itself. Some things were buried for a reason. Kael didn't respond. He turned on his heel, his mind racing with the implications of what he just learned. The station's archives were no longer just a repository of knowledge. They were a lifeline, a weapon, and a target. And as the sound of distant explosions echoed through the station, he knew one thing for certain. The fight for humanity's survival had just become a race against time. The dim glow of Mara's console illuminated her face as her fingers flew across the interface, decoding the cryptic signal that had been haunting them. The hum of the station's failing systems buzzed in the background, a constant reminder of their fragile state. Got it, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the noise. Her eyes widened as the screen displayed a set of coordinates, pinpointing a location on Earth, a place that shouldn't exist. Commander, you need to see this. Kael approached, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. What is it? Mara turned to him, her voice steady but urgent. The signal wasn't just a warning. It's a map. These coordinates lead to a facility buried deep in the ruins of Earth. It's called Site Alpha, some kind of research outpost, hidden from the records. If the archives here are incomplete, if there's more we don't know about the void, it's there. Kael stared at the screen, his mind racing. Earth was a graveyard, its surface a toxic wasteland after centuries of war and environmental collapse. Returning there was suicide or worse. Even if this facility exists, he said slowly, getting to it would mean navigating radiation zones, scavenger factions, and whatever's left of the planet's defenses. We'd be risking everything on a hunch. Mara's gaze was unwavering. It's not a hunch, Kael. This signal, it's too precise, too deliberate. Whoever sent it wanted us to find this. And if there's even a chance it holds answers, we have to take it. What other choice do we have? Stay here and wait for the void to finish us off? Before Kael could respond, the station shuddered violently, the lights flickering as a deafening alarm blared through the corridors. Mara's console lit up with red warnings. Incoming attack, she shouted, her voice strained. The void, they're back, and this time they're not holding back. Kael's fists clenched as he turned to the observation window. The void warship loomed larger than ever, its dark hull blotting out the stars. A swarm of smaller vessels detached from its surface, their movements swift and predatory. The station's shields, already weakened, flickered precariously. All hands brace for impact, Kael barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The first wave of plasma fire struck with devastating force, tearing through the station's outer defenses. The lights dimmed, and the air grew colder as life support systems struggled to keep up. Mara's console sparked, forcing her to step back. We can't take another hit like that. She yelled over the noise. If we don't act now, we're done for. Kael's mind raced, torn between the immediate threat and the possibility of salvation hidden on Earth. The station groaned under the strain, its metal frame buckling as the void's assault intensified. Mara, he said, his voice low but resolute, if we go to Earth, it's a one-way trip. No reinforcements, no backup, just us. Mara met his gaze, her determination unwavering. It's our only chance, Kael. If we stay here, we die. If we go, at least we're fighting for something. For answers, for survival. The station shook again, the sound of rending metal echoing through the corridors. Kael's jaw tightened as he made his decision. Prepare the shuttle, he ordered. We're going to Earth. But we're not just running, we're taking the fight to them. As the crew scrambled to carry out his orders, Mara returned to her console, her hands moving swiftly to upload the coordinates to the shuttle's navigation system. The Void's warship loomed closer, its weapons charging for another attack. Time was running out, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a plan. The station's engines roared to life, their strained hum a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the Void's advance. Kael glanced at the observation window one last time, his resolve hardening. Earth was a graveyard, but it was also a battlefield, and if there was even a glimmer of hope buried beneath its ruins, they would find it, or die trying. The shuttle's engines roared as it descended through Earth-shattered atmosphere. The once blue skies, now a swirling maelstrom of toxic clouds and ash. Kael gripped the controls, his knuckles white, as the vessel rattled violently against the turbulence. Outside, jagged lightning split the sky, illuminating the ruins of a civilization long lost. Mara sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the navigation screen, her voice steady despite the chaos. We're entering the radiation zone, shield integrity at 60%. This is going to be close. Kael glanced at the readings, his jaw tightening. We don't have a choice. If the signal's right, Site Alpha's our only shot. The shuttle dipped lower, skimming over the skeletal remains of cities that once teemed with life. Towering skyscrapers, now crumbling and blackened, loomed like gravestones against the horizon. Rivers of molten metal flowed through the streets, their glow casting an eerie light on the devastation below. Mara's voice broke the silence, her tone grim. Radiation levels are spiking. We've got about 10 minutes before the shields give out. We need to land now. Kael nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain for a safe spot. The shuttle plunged toward a clearing, its thrusters screaming as it fought against the planet's pull. With a bone-jarring impact, the vessel touched down, its hull groaning under the strain. The moment the hatch opened, a wave of acrid air rushed in, burning their lungs even through the filters of their suits. Kael stepped out first, his boots crunching against the cracked, glass-like ground. The sky above churned with storms, the air thick with ash and the faint hum of radiation. Mara followed, her weapon drawn, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape. This place, it's worse than I imagined, she muttered, her voice muffled by the rebreather. Kael adjusted his gear, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Stay sharp. If the Void's here, they'll know we've landed. The two moved cautiously through the ruins, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The facility wasn't far. According to the coordinates, it lay just beyond the remains of what was once a sprawling urban center. But as they approached, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. The facility emerged from the haze, its massive steel doors partially buried under rubble, but something was wrong. The ground around it was scarred with claw-like marks, and the air buzzed with an unnatural energy. Mara froze, her voice dropping to a whisper. Kael, look. He followed her gaze to the facility's entrance, where sleek, black sentinels stood motionless, their glowing green eyes scanning the area. Void constructs machines designed to guard, to kill. Kael's grip tightened on his weapon. We've got company, he murmured. The pair moved into position, using the ruins as cover. Mara's voice was barely audible over the howling wind. We can't take them head on. There's too many. We need a distraction. Kael nodded, his mind racing. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small device. EMP charge, it'll buy us some time, but we'll only get one shot at this. As they prepared to act, a faint sound reached their ears. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like a heartbeat. Mara's eyes widened as she turned to Kael, her voice trembling. We're not alone down here. From the shadows of the ruins, More shapes emerged, humanoid figures cloaked in darkness, their movements fluid and deliberate. Kael's pulse quickened as he realized the truth. These weren't void constructs. They were something else, something worse. The hum grew louder, the air crackling with tension as the figures closed in. Kael's voice was a low growl. Whatever happens, we get inside that facility, no matter what. Mara nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon. The shadows moved closer, their glowing eyes piercing the gloom. The fight for survival had brought them to Earth's surface, but now, it seemed, the planet itself was alive, and it wasn't on their side. The EMP charge in Kael's hand was their only hope, but as the figures advanced, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap far deadlier than the void itself. The steel doors of the facility groaned as Kael and Mara forced them open, the ancient mechanisms protesting after centuries of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint hum of dormant machinery. Flickering emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls, revealing a labyrinth of corridors lined with forgotten technology. Kael's voice was low, almost reverent, as they stepped inside. This place, it's been waiting for us, for someone to find it. Mara's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating rows of consoles and storage units, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of ash. If the signal led us here, there has to be something worth finding. Let's move. We don't have much time. The two pressed forward, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The deeper they went, the more the facility seemed to come alive, faint lights blinking to life as they passed. At the heart of the facility, they found it. A massive chamber dominated by a towering structure, its sleek, angular design unlike anything they'd ever seen. At its center was a weapon, its surface etched with glowing runes that pulsed faintly, as though alive. Kael approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. This is what they were hiding, a weapon capable of destroying the Void Fleet. Mara's eyes widened as she scanned the console beside it, her fingers flying across the ancient interface. It's not just a weapon, it's a singularity generator, a device that can collapse space-time within a localized area. It's designed to annihilate everything in its radius, void or otherwise. Her voice trembled with a mix of awe and dread. If we activate this, it could end the war, but Kael's gaze hardened as he turned to her. But what? The energy required to power it, it's massive. It would drain Elysium's core completely. The station wouldn't survive the process. Mara's words hung in the air like a death sentence. We'd be sacrificing everything, everyone, to use it. Kael stepped back, his mind racing. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, each option more devastating than the last. We can't just throw away the last of humanity. There has to be another way. Mara's voice cut through his hesitation, sharp and urgent. Kael, look at the readings. The Void's fleet is already closing in on Elysium. If we don't act now, they'll destroy the station anyway. This weapon, it's not just a last resort. It's the only way to stop them for good. Kael turned to face her, his expression torn. And what about the people on the station? Our crew, they're counting on us to save them, not to what? Let them die along with the rest of humanity. Mara's voice cracked, her frustration boiling over. Kael, I know this is hard. I don't want to lose them either. But if we don't do this, the Void wins. They erase us completely. This weapon gives us a chance, a real chance, to end this war, to make sure humanity survives, even if it's not the way we hoped. The chamber fell silent, the faint hum of the weapon the only sound. Kael's gaze shifted to the glowing runes, their light reflecting in his eyes. He thought of the station, of the people he'd sworn to protect, of the Void, relentless and unstoppable. and he thought of the choice before him, a choice that would define humanity's future, for better or worse. Mara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. We don't have time to second-guess this. The void's coming, and they won't stop until we're all gone. This is our only shot. Please, Kael, trust me. Kael exhaled sharply, his resolve hardening. All right, we do it, but not without a fight. We'll give the station every last drop of power we can spare before we activate this thing. And then, we end this war. As the two worked to prepare the weapon, the facility shuddered, the distant sound of explosions echoing through the corridors. The void had found them, and as the lights flickered and the ground trembled, Kael knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of the end. The shuttle's engines roared as Kael and Mara broke through Earth's atmosphere, the dark, swirling clouds giving way to the cold expanse of space. Behind them, the void's fleet loomed like a storm on the horizon, their ships slicing through the void with terrifying speed. Kael gripped the controls, his eyes darting between the navigation screen and the rear view display. They're gaining on us, he muttered, his voice tense. Hold on, this is going to get rough. Mara clung to her seat, her fingers flying across the console as she rerouted power to the engines. Shields are at 30%. If they hit us again, we're done for. The shuttle shuddered violently as a plasma bolt grazed the hull, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. Kael's hands moved swiftly, adjusting their trajectory to evade the next barrage. The void's ships were relentless, their movements precise and calculated. Kael's jaw tightened as he glanced at Mara. We're not going to make it back to Elysium like this. We need a distraction, something to buy us time. Mara's eyes widened as she caught his meaning. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, are you? Kael, no, he cut her off, his voice firm. It's the only way. If we both go down, the weapon's useless. You get to the station, I'll draw their fire. Before she could protest, Kael activated the shuttle's escape pod systems, his hands moving with practiced precision. The console beeped as the pod's controls lit up, its engines humming to life. Mara's voice was sharp, laced with desperation. Kael, don't do this. We can find another way. He turned to her, his gaze steady but resolute. There is no other way. The void's not going to stop until they've got us, or the weapon. If I can buy you even a few minutes, it'll be enough. Get the weapon to Elysium, no matter what. The shuttle shook again, a deafening explosion rocking the hull. Kael's hand hovered over the release button, his heart pounding. Mara, listen to me. You're the only one who can finish this. You've got the coordinates, the knowledge, the skill. Don't let it all be for nothing. Tears welled in Mara's eyes, but she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael, don't do anything stupid. He managed a faint smile, his tone softening. When have I ever done anything stupid? With a final glance, he pressed the button. The escape pod's engines roared as it detached from the shuttle, its thrusters flaring as it veered sharply away. Kael's voice crackled over the comms, calm but urgent. Go, Mara, now. The void's ships hesitated for a moment, their sensors locking onto the pod's energy signature. Then, like predators chasing prey, they broke formation, their weapons trained on the smaller vessel. Mara's hands trembled as she guided the shuttle toward Elysium, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the rear-view display, watching as the void's fleet closed in on the pod. Kael's voice came through again, steady despite the chaos. You've got this, Mara. Just keep moving, and don't look back. The words were barely out of his mouth when the void's plasma fire engulfed the pod, its engines exploding in a brilliant flash of light. Mara's breath caught in her throat, her hands tightening on the controls. Kael, she whispered, her voice breaking, but there was no time to grieve. The shuttle's proximity alarms blared as Elysium's silhouette came into view, its battered hull a stark reminder of the stakes. Mara wiped her eyes, her resolve hardening. She had a mission to complete, a weapon to deliver, and as the Void's ships turned their attention back to her, she knew one thing for certain: Kael's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. The shuttle streaked toward the station, its engines straining against the Void's relentless pursuit. Mara's mind raced, her focus sharpening as she prepared for the final leg of their journey. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and as long as she had the weapon, humanity still had a chance. The shuttle's thrusters roared as Mara guided it into Elysium's docking bay, the station's battered hull looming like a beacon of both hope and despair. The moment the hatch hissed open, she was met with chaos. Crew members scrambled through the corridors, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The station's alarms blared, a constant reminder of the Void's relentless advance. Mara stepped out, the weight of the Singularity generator's schematics heavy in her hands, and was immediately surrounded by a crowd of desperate faces. "Did you find it?" Lieutenant Reyes demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "Do we have a way to fight back?" Mara nodded, holding up the data pad. "We've got it. But it's going to cost us everything." Her words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Before she could elaborate, Commander Hayes pushed through the crowd, his expression grim. "Cost us everything? What does that mean?" he barked, his tone laced with frustration. "We've already lost too many people. If this weapon's as dangerous as you're implying, we need to evacuate now." The room erupted into arguments, voices overlapping as the crew split into factions. Some shouted for immediate evacuation, their eyes darting to the observation windows where the Void's fleet loomed ever closer. Others, their loyalty to Kael unshaken, demanded a rescue mission. "We can't just leave him out there," one of the engineers cried, his voice breaking. "He gave us a chance. We owe him that much." Mara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Listen to me," she shouted, her tone commanding but tinged with desperation. "Kael's gone. He bought us time, but the Void's not stopping. If we don't act now, none of us are getting out of this alive." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Mara's gaze swept across the crew, her voice softening but no less resolute. "I know you're scared. I am too, but this isn't just about survival anymore. If we run, the Void wins. They erase us, just like they've erased everyone else. This weapon, it's our last chance to fight back, to make sure humanity doesn't end here, in the shadows of what we've lost." Hayes crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. "And what happens if we use it? If it drains the station's core, we're all dead anyway." Mara met his gaze, her eyes blazing with determination. "Maybe, but if we don't, we're dead for sure. At least this way, we go out swinging. We take the Void with us. Isn't that worth something?" The silence that followed was deafening. Reyes stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "She's right. We've been running for too long. If this is our last stand, let's make it count." Mara nodded, her heart pounding as she turned to the crew. "This isn't just about Kael or me or any one of us. It's about all of us. We fight for each other or we die alone. The choice is yours." The Void's fleet was closer now, their dark ships blotting out the stars. The station's shields flickered precariously, their glow a faint reminder of their dwindling time. Mara's words seemed to hang in the air, a call to arms that resonated deep within the crew. Slowly, one by one, they nodded, their fear giving way to determination. As the crew moved to prepare the weapon, Mara felt a surge of hope amidst the dread. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. But for the first time, in what felt like forever, they were united. And in the face of annihilation, that might just be enough. The first thing Kael felt was cold, a sharp, biting chill that seeped into his bones. His vision swam as he blinked awake, the dim, pulsating light of the room slowly coming into focus. The air was thick with an acrid, metallic scent, and the walls around him shimmered with an iridescent black sheen, like oil on water. He tried to move, but his limbs were restrained by glowing energy bonds that hummed faintly, their light casting an eerie glow on his skin. Panic surged through him as he realized where he was aboard a void ship. The last thing he remembered was the escape pod exploding, the blinding flash of plasma fire, and then nothing. He strained against the bonds, his mind racing. How was he still alive? And more importantly, why? Before he could piece together an answer, the room shifted. A section of the wall shimmered and dissolved, revealing a figure stepping through. Tall and cloaked in flowing black robes, the figure's presence was suffocating, its face obscured by a mask that seemed to absorb the light around it. Kael's breath hitched as the figure approached, its movements unnervingly fluid, like a shadow given form. "You are awake," the figure said, its voice a low, resonant hum that reverberated in Kael's chest. "Good, I have been waiting for this moment, Commander Voss." Kael's jaw tightened, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, the mask's blank surface reflecting the faint glow of the energy bonds. "I am the Harbinger, the voice of the void, the end of your kind." Kael's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to find a way out, but he needed answers first. "If you're going to kill me, get on with it. If not, start talking." The Harbinger let out a sound that might have been a laugh, though it carried no warmth. "Kill you? No, Commander, you are special, a relic of a time long forgotten. A time when your kind sought to end war, to create peace through destruction. Do you not remember?" Kael frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" The Harbinger's voice grew quieter, almost mournful. "Centuries ago, your ancestors sought to end conflict by creating the ultimate weapon, a force that could erase war itself. They called it the Void, but their creation grew beyond their control, evolving into something they could not comprehend, and so they tried to destroy it. To bury it, to forget." Kael's heart pounded as the pieces began to fall into place. "You're saying the Void was created by humans?" The Harbinger stepped closer, its mask looming over him. "Yes, you created us to end war, and now we will end you. It is poetic, is it not?" Kael's mind raced, the implications of the Harbinger's words sinking in. The Void wasn't some alien menace. It was humanity's own creation, a weapon turned against its creators. But if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to stop it. He forced himself to stay calm, his voice steady. "If you were created to end war, why destroy us? Isn't that the opposite of your purpose?" The Harbinger's mask tilted again, its tone almost mocking. "War is a product of chaos, of free will. To end war, we must end those who wage it. Your kind is incapable of peace, and so you must be erased." Kael's fists clenched behind his back, his mind working furiously. He needed to buy time, to find a weakness. And what if we've changed? What if we're not the same as the ones who created you? The Harbinger's response was immediate, its voice cold and final. "You have not changed. We have seen your history, your wars, your destruction. You are the same as you have always been, and now you will face the consequences." As the Harbinger turned to leave, Kael's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use. His gaze landed on a faint seam in the wall, a ventilation shaft, perhaps. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. The Harbinger paused at the doorway, its mask turning slightly. "Do not struggle, Commander. Your end will be swift. And when it comes, know that it was your own hands that brought it upon you." The moment the Harbinger disappeared, Kael began to work. He twisted his wrists, testing the bonds. They were tight, but not unbreakable. His fingers brushed against a loose edge of the energy field, and he gritted his teeth, pushing against it with all his strength. Pain shot through his arms, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. As the bonds flickered and weakened, Kael's mind raced with a single thought. He had to get back to Elysium. The Harbinger's revelation changed everything. If the void was human-made, then maybe, just maybe, it could be undone. But first, he had to escape. The energy bonds snapped with a sharp crack, and Kael dropped to the floor, his body aching, but his resolve unshaken. He glanced at the vent, then back at the door. The void might have created him, but they'd underestimated him, and that was a mistake they'd regret. The air inside the void ship was thick with an unnatural hum, a constant reminder of the alien technology that surrounded him. Kael moved swiftly through the darkened corridors, his movements precise despite the lingering ache in his limbs. The Harbinger's revelation still echoed in his mind. The void was humanity's creation, a weapon turned against its creators. But if it was made by humans, it could be unmade, and Kael was determined to prove it. He reached the core chamber, a massive, pulsating structure that throbbed with an eerie green light. The air around it crackled with energy, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. Kael's eyes scanned the room, taking in the intricate network of conduits and panels that fed the core. This was the heart of the void ship, the source of its power, and if he could disrupt it, even temporarily, it might buy Elysium the time it needed. Kael's hands flew across the control panel, his fingers working quickly to override the ship's security protocols. The void's systems were unlike anything he'd encountered before, their design both alien and strangely familiar. As he worked, the Harbinger's words came back to him. "You created us to end war." If that was true, then the void's technology had to have a weakness, a flaw in its design that he could exploit. The panel sparked as he bypassed another layer of security, the core's hum growing erratic. Kael's heart pounded as he activated the sabotage sequence, the ship's alarms blaring in response. The core began to pulse faster, its light flickering wildly. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before the entire system overloaded. Kael turned and sprinted down the corridor, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The ship shuddered violently, the walls groaning as the core's energy destabilized. He reached the escape pods just as the first explosion rocked the ship, the force throwing him against the wall. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he pushed through it, his focus sharp. The pod's hatch hissed open, and Kael dove inside, slamming his hand against the launch controls. The pod shot out of the ship, just as the core reached critical mass, the blinding flash of the explosion illuminating the void. Kael shielded his eyes, the force of the blast rattling the pod as it hurtled away from the disintegrating ship. Behind him, the void fleet was thrown into chaos. The explosion crippled several ships, their hulls buckling under the shockwave. Others veered off course, their formations breaking apart as the chain reaction spread. Kael's pod tumbled through the debris field, its engines sputtering as it struggled to stabilize. On Elysium, Mara stood at the observation window, her breath catching as a distant fireball lit up the darkness. She pressed a hand to the glass, her voice a whisper. "He's still alive." The crew behind her erupted into cheers, the tension in the room dissipating as the void fleet faltered. Mara's heart raced, a mix of relief and determination flooding her veins. Kael had bought them time precious, irreplaceable time, but she knew this wasn't over. The void would regroup, and when they did, they'd come back stronger. Mara turned to the crew, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We've got a window. Let's make it count. Prep the singularity generator. We're going to end this." As the crew scrambled to carry out her orders, Mara's gaze lingered on the distant fireball, her mind racing with possibilities. Kael had survived the impossible once. If anyone could find a way to stop the void for good, it was him, and she'd be ready when he returned. The pod's system stabilized, its trajectory aligning with Elysium's coordinates. Kael leaned back in the seat, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. The void had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again, and as the station came into view, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The pod shuddered as it docked with Elysium, its battered hull groaning under the strain. Kael stepped out, his movements stiff but deliberate, the weight of exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The station's corridors were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense, almost suffocating silence. As he made his way to the command center, the crew he passed stared at him with a mix of relief and suspicion. Whispers trailed in his wake, their words sharp and uncertain. "He's been on a void ship. What if they've done something to him? How do we know he's still one of us?" Kael ignored the murmurs, his focus locked on the task ahead. But as he entered the command center, the tension in the room was palpable. Mara stood at the center of the chaos, her face lighting up with relief as she saw him. Before she could speak, Commander Hayes stepped forward, his arms crossed and his expression hard. "Commander Voss," Hayes began, his tone clipped, "you'll forgive us if we're cautious. You've been on a void ship. For all we know, you could be compromised." Kael's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to finish this." Hayes' eyes narrowed. "And how do we know you're not leading us into a trap? The void doesn't let people go, not unless it's part of their plan." Mara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "He's not compromised. He's our best chance to survive. If anyone can find a way to stop the void, it's him." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Kael met Hayes' gaze, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "I've seen their core. I know how they work. They're not invincible. If we hit them the right way, we can take them down, but we're running out of time." Hayes hesitated, his skepticism warring with the desperate need for answers. Before he could respond, the station shuddered violently, the lights flickering as another plasma barrage struck the outer shields. Alarms blared, and the holographic display lit up with red warnings. Mara's voice was sharp, her frustration boiling over. "We don't have the luxury of doubt right now. The void's not going to stop and wait for us to figure this out. Either we trust him, or we die here. Your call." The room erupted into arguments, voices overlapping as the crew split into factions. Some shouted for immediate action, their loyalty to Kael unshaken. Others, their fear of the void too great, demanded caution. Kael stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Listen to me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I don't have all the answers, but I know this. The void was created by us, by humans, and if we made it, we can destroy it. But we need to act now. Every second we waste, they get stronger. And we get weaker." The station groaned under the strain, its systems faltering as the void's relentless assault continued. The holographic display flickered, showing the shields at critical levels. Hayes exhaled sharply, his resolve hardening. "Fine," he said, his tone grudging. "But if this goes south, it's on you." Kael nodded, his gaze shifting to Mara. "We need to prep the singularity generator. If we can overload their core, we can take out their entire fleet, but it's going to be close." Mara's eyes met his, a flicker of determination in their depths. "We'll make it work. We don't have a choice." As the crew scrambled to carry out the plan, the station's lights flickered again, their glow dimming as the power reserves dwindled. The Void's fleet loomed closer, their dark ships blotting out the stars. Kael's mind raced with the enormity of what they were about to attempt. Failure wasn't an option. Not this time. The command center buzzed with frantic activity, the crew's fear giving way to a grim determination. Kael's return had reignited a spark of hope, but it was a fragile thing, easily extinguished. As the station trembled under another barrage, he knew one thing for certain. This was their last stand, and they would either go down fighting or take the Void with them. The command center was a whirlwind of activity, the air crackling with tension as the crew scrambled to prepare the singularity generator. Mara stood at the center of it all, her fingers dancing across the console as she input the final commands. The holographic display flickered, showing the Void fleet closing in, their dark ships blotting out the stars. Kael stood beside her, his expression grim but resolute. "The weapons ready," Mara announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But it's going to take everything we've got." A full power surged from the station's core. Aegis' voice cut through the noise, calm but urgent. "Commander Voss, activating the weapon will drain the station's power reserves entirely. We will be left defenseless." Kael's jaw tightened as he glanced at the display, the Void's ships looming larger with every passing second. "We're already out of options," he replied, his tone firm. "If we don't use this now, we're dead anyway. At least this way, we take them with us." Mara's hands hovered over the activation switch, her eyes meeting Kael's. "This is it. Once I flip this, there's no turning back." Kael nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Do it." The moment Mara activated the weapon, the station shuddered violently, its lights dimming as the power surge coursed through its systems. The holographic display flickered, showing the singularity generator coming online, its energy core pulsing with an intense, almost blinding light. Outside, the Void fleet reacted immediately. Their ships shifted formation, their weapons charging as they prepared to unleash a final, devastating barrage. The station's shields flickered and died, their faint blue glow extinguished as the power reserves drained. Aegis' voice was calm but tinged with urgency. "Power levels at critical, shields offline, life support systems failing." Kael's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "All hands, brace for impact. This is it, hold the line." The Void's attack came in a wave of blinding plasma fire, their weapons tearing through the station's hull with terrifying precision. Explosions rocked the corridors, the sound of rending metal echoing through the station. The crew scrambled to maintain their positions, their faces pale but determined. Mara's voice was barely audible over the noise. "The weapon's charging, but it's going to be close. We need to hold them off until it's ready." Kael's eyes darted to the display, his mind racing. The Void's ships were closing in, their movements calculated and relentless. "We're not going to make it," he muttered, his voice low. "Not unless we buy ourselves some time." He turned to Mara, his expression grim. "I'm taking a team out there. We'll distract them, give the weapon time to charge." Mara's eyes widened, her voice sharp with protest. "Kael, no. That's suicide." He met her gaze, his tone steady but filled with urgency. "It's the only way. If we don't slow them down, the weapon won't matter." We'll all be dead before it's ready." Before she could respond, Kael was already moving, his voice ringing out across the command center. "Volunteers with me. We're going out there to buy time. Let's make it count." The crew hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, their faces set with determination. Mara watched as they prepared to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to stop him, to tell him there had to be another way, but deep down, she knew he was right. As Kael and his team made their way to the docking bay, Mara turned back to the console, her hands trembling as she monitored the weapon's progress. The station groaned under the strain, its systems failing as the void's assault intensified. The singularity generator was almost ready, its energy core pulsing faster and faster. But the void's ships were closing in, their weapons locking onto the station. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. They were running out of time. Outside, Kael and his team launched into the void, their small ships darting through the debris field as they drew the void's fire. The station trembled violently, its hull buckling under the relentless assault. Mara's voice was a whisper, her words heavy with dread. "Come on, just a little longer." The weapon's core reached critical mass, its light blinding as it prepared to unleash its devastating power. But the void's ships were almost upon them, their weapons fully charged and ready to strike. Kael's voice crackled over the comms, calm but filled with resolve. "Mara, do it." Her hand hovered over the activation switch, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, their last desperate chance. With a deep breath, she flipped the switch, the weapon's energy core erupting in a blinding flash of light. The void's ships hesitated for a moment, their movements faltering as the singularity generator unleashed its power. Then, with a deafening roar, the weapon's energy surged outward, engulfing the void fleet in a wave of destruction. The station trembled violently, its systems failing as the weapon's energy drained its last reserves. Mara gripped the console, her vision blurring as the lights flickered and died. In the void, Kael watched as the void's ships were consumed by the weapon's energy, their dark forms disintegrating into nothingness. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips as the station's systems finally gave out, the last of its power reserves depleted. The fight was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. The blinding light of the singularity generator's discharge faded, leaving behind a haunting silence. The void fleet, once a looming shadow of destruction, was gone, reduced to ash and debris scattered across the void, but the victory came at a cost. Elysium's power grid, strained to its limit, collapsed completely. The station's lights flickered and died, plunging the corridors into darkness. The faint hum of life support systems sputtered and ceased, leaving only the cold, stale air of a dying vessel. Kael's voice cut through the silence, sharp and urgent. "Report, what's our status?" Mara's hands flew across the darkened console, her face illuminated by the faint glow of emergency displays. "Power's gone. Shields, engines, life support, everything's offline. We're dead in the void." The station groaned ominously, its metal frame creaking as it began to drift. The holographic display flickered weakly, showing Elysium's trajectory. Kael's heart sank as he realized the truth. We're caught in Earth's gravitational pull. If we don't act now, we'll burn up in the atmosphere. The crew exchanged panicked glances, their fear palpable. Kael's voice rose above the chaos, commanding and resolute. "Abandon ship now. Get to the escape pods. Move." The corridors erupted into chaos as the crew scrambled to evacuate, their footsteps echoing through the darkened halls. Kael grabbed Mara's arm, his grip firm but gentle. "You're coming with me. We're not losing anyone else." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they raced through the station, the sound of rending metal growing louder with every step. The escape pods were already filling up, their hatches slamming shut as crew members launched into the void. Kael and Mara reached the last pod, its interior cramped but functional. As the pod launched, Kael glanced back at Elysium, its once proud silhouette now a broken, lifeless hulk drifting toward Earth. The station had been their home, their last bastion of hope. Now it was a tomb, a monument to the sacrifices they'd made. The pod's engines roared as it broke free of the station's gravitational pull, the void stretching out before them. Mara's voice was soft, almost a whisper. What happens now? Where do we go from here? Kael's gaze turned toward Earth, its surface a swirling mass of ash and storm. We survive, he said simply. We find a way to rebuild. The void's gone, but we're still here, and as long as we're alive, there's hope. The pod's systems hummed as it stabilized, its trajectory set for a safe landing zone. Behind them, Elysium began its final descent, its hull glowing red as it entered Earth's atmosphere. The station burned bright, a fiery streak across the sky, before disintegrating into nothingness. Kael leaned back in his seat, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. They had fought the impossible and won, but the battle for survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the pod descended through the stormy atmosphere, its occupants braced for the unknown. Earth was a graveyard, its surface a toxic wasteland. But somewhere, hidden beneath the ruins, lay the seeds of a new beginning. Kael's resolve hardened as the pod touched down, its hatch hissing open to reveal a world that had once been home. The fight wasn't over, not yet, and as long as they drew breath, humanity would endure. The pod's hatch hissed shut behind the last of the crew, the sound of their hurried footsteps fading into the void. Kael and Mara stood alone in the dimly lit command center, the air growing colder as the station's life support systems sputtered their final breaths. The holographic display flickered weakly, showing the escape pods streaking toward safety, their tiny lights a stark contrast to the dark expanse of space. Kael's voice was calm, almost serene, as he turned to Mara. They'll make it. That's what matters. Mara's hands trembled as she adjusted the console, her fingers flying across the controls in a desperate attempt to stabilize the station. We're not done yet, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. If we can keep the core from collapsing, we might buy them a little more time. The station groaned ominously, its metal frame buckling under the strain. The holographic display showed the hull temperature rising rapidly, the outer layers beginning to glow a faint red as the station entered Earth's atmosphere. Kael moved to her side, his movements deliberate despite the chaos around them. We're not going to make it out of this, Mara. You know that, right? She glanced at him, her expression a mix of determination and sorrow. I know, but if we can give them even a few more minutes, it'll be worth it. The station shuddered violently, the sound of rending metal echoing through the corridor. Kael's hands found hers, his grip firm but gentle. You don't have to stay. You could still make it to the last pod. Mara shook her head, her voice resolute. I'm not leaving you, not now, not ever. The two worked in silence, their movements synchronized as they fought to stabilize the station. The holographic display showed the escape pods reaching a safe distance, their trajectories clear of Earth's gravitational pull. Kael's voice was soft, almost a whisper. We did it. They're going to make it. Mara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yeah, we did. The station groaned again, the sound of metal buckling under the intense heat. The holographic display flickered and died, the last of its power reserves depleted. The command center was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the observation window, where the station's hull glowed a bright, fiery red. Kael turned to Mara, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We gave them a future. That's enough." She met his gaze, her expression softening. "It is." The station trembled violently, the sound of explosions echoing through the corridors. The observation window cracked, the glass splintering under the intense heat. Kael reached for Mara's hand, his grip firm. "Stay with me." She nodded, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Always." The station's hull began to disintegrate, the fiery glow intensifying as it entered the atmosphere. Outside, the escape pods streaked through the void, their tiny lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. Inside, Kael and Mara stood together, their hands clasped tightly as the station burned around them. The last thing Kael saw was the faint light of the escape pods, their trajectories clear and steady. He smiled faintly, his voice a whisper. "We did it, Mara. We gave them a chance." She squeezed his hand, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "We did." The station's hull finally gave way, the intense heat consuming everything in its path. Outside, the escape pods reached safety, their occupants watching in silence as Elysium burned bright, a fiery streak across the sky before disintegrating into nothingness. Kael and Mara's sacrifice had given them a future, a chance to rebuild, to survive, and as the last of the station's debris fell to Earth, the void was silent once more. But somewhere, deep in the hearts of those who had escaped, the memory of their sacrifice burned bright, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The station's descent into Earth's atmosphere was swift and merciless, its hull glowing a fiery red as the friction of re-entry began to tear it apart. Kael and Mara clung to the console in the command center, the air growing thinner with each passing second. The holographic display flickered weakly, showing the escape pods streaking away to safety, their tiny lights a beacon of hope in the void. But for Kael and Mara, there was no escape. The station was their tomb, and they knew it. "Systems are failing faster than I can stabilize them," Mara said, her voice tight with frustration as she worked furiously at the controls. "If we don't do something soon, the core is going to collapse and take the rest of the station with it." Kael's eyes darted across the console, searching for anything they could use to buy time. Then, buried beneath layers of corrupted data, he spotted it, a faint, pulsing signal that hadn't been there before. "Mara, look at this," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "There's a hidden program here, some kind of failsafe. It's buried deep, but it's active." Mara's hands flew across the interface, her expression shifting from despair to cautious hope. "You're right. It's an emergency protocol designed to reroute power to the core and stabilize the station long enough for a controlled descent. But it's a one-shot deal. If we activate it, there's no turning back." Kael didn't hesitate. "Do it. If it gives the crew a chance to make it to the surface, it's worth it." Mara's fingers danced across the console, her movements precise despite the chaos around them. The station groaned as the failsafe activated, its systems rerouting power to the core. The holographic display flickered back to life, showing the station's trajectory stabilizing barely. But the cost was immediate. The command center's lights dimmed, the air growing colder as the failsafe drained the last of the station's reserves. Kael's breath was visible in the frosty air as he turned to Mara, his voice steady despite the weight of their decision. "It's working. The station's holding for now." Outside, the crew in the escape pods watched in stunned silence as Elysium's fiery descent slowed, its trajectory leveling out. But their relief was short-lived. The station's core, already damaged beyond repair, began to emit a faint, ominous hum. The holographic display showed the containment field weakening, its energy fluctuating wildly. Mara's voice was calm, but filled with dread. The failsafes bought us time, but the core is still unstable. If it breaches, the station won't just burn up, it'll explode. Kael's jaw tightened as he glanced at the escape pods on the display, their tiny lights growing fainter as they reached a safe distance. Then we make sure it doesn't. We stay here and keep the core stable as long as we can. Mara nodded, her expression resolute. Together, the station groaned again, its metal frame buckling under the strain. The holographic display flickered, showing the core's containment field weakening further. Kael and Mara worked in silence, their movements synchronized as they fought to keep the station intact. But with every passing second, the inevitable drew closer. Outside, the crew watched in horror as Elysium's hull began to crack, the fiery glow intensifying. The station was holding, but for how long and at what cost? Inside the command center, Kael's voice was soft but steady. We gave them a chance, Mara. That's all we could do. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's enough. The station's core hummed louder, its energy fluctuating wildly as the containment field began to fail. Kael and Mara stood together, their hands clasped tightly as the station burned around them. They had bought the crew time to reach the surface, to survive, to rebuild. And as the station's hull finally gave way, the fiery glow intensifying as it entered the atmosphere, Kael and Mara's sacrifice became a beacon of hope in the darkness. The crew watched in silence as Elysium disintegrated, its fiery streak across the sky, a testament to the courage of those who had given everything to save them. The fight was over, but the legacy of their sacrifice would endure, a reminder that even in the face of annihilation, humanity could still find a way to hope. The escape pods landed on the barren surface of a nearby moon, its gray, cratered landscape stretching out in every direction under a pale, lifeless sky. The survivors stumbled out, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Elysium was gone, and with it, Kael and Mara. The weight of their loss hung heavy in the air, a suffocating silence broken only by the faint hum of the pod's cooling systems. Lieutenant Reyes was the first to speak, his voice hoarse but firm. We need to regroup, establish a perimeter. Aegis, can you give us a status update? The AI's voice emanated from a portable console, its tone calm, but tinged with an unfamiliar solemnity. Survivors accounted for 87, supplies limited. Oxygen reserves at 30%, immediate shelter required. The crew moved quickly, their training kicking in as they set up makeshift shelters and scavenged what they could from the pods. But the absence of Kael and Mara was palpable. They had been more than leaders, they had been the heart of the crew, the glue that held them together. Now, without them, the survivors felt adrift, their purpose uncertain. It was then that Aegis spoke again, its voice cutting through the silence. I have a message. From Commander Kael Voss. The crew froze, their attention snapping to the console. Reyes stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Play it. A hologram flickered to life, Kael's image materializing before them. His face was calm, but resolute, his voice steady despite the chaos that had surrounded him. To anyone who's hearing this, if you're listening, then you made it. That's what matters. I don't have much time, so I'll keep this short. Rebuild, survive. Remember us. We fought to give you a future, and now it's up to you to make it count. Don't let our sacrifice be in vain. Find a way to carry on, for all of us. The hologram faded, leaving the crew in stunned silence. Mara's absence was felt even more acutely now. Her quiet strength and unwavering determination, a stark contrast to the emptiness around them. Reyes cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. He's right, we owe it to them, to everyone we've lost. To keep going, we've got a second chance. Let's not waste it. The survivors nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. One by one, they began to speak, their voices steady but filled with emotion. For Kael, someone said. For Mara, another added. And then, louder, more voices joined in. For Elysium, for humanity. The crew worked through the night, their grief channeled into action. They scouted the moon's surface, searching for resources and potential shelter. Aegis guided them, its calm, methodical voice, a steady presence amidst the chaos. But even as they worked, Kael's words echoed in their minds: rebuild, survive, remember us. As the pale light of the moon's star rose over the horizon, Reyes gathered the survivors. This isn't the end, he said, his voice carrying across the barren landscape. It's the beginning. We've got a long road ahead, but we've got each other. And we've got their legacy. Let's make it count. The crew stood together, their faces turned toward the sky where Elysium had once been. The station was gone, but its spirit lived on in them. They had survived the impossible, and now they would build something new, something worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them here. And as they set to work, the weight of their loss began to shift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. They would rebuild, they would survive, and they would remember. The survivors moved with purpose, their hands calloused and their spirits weary but unbroken. The barren moon, once a lifeless expanse of gray dust and jagged rock, slowly transformed into a makeshift sanctuary. Prefabricated shelters rose from the ground, their metallic frames glinting under the pale light of the distant star. Solar arrays were carefully positioned to harness what little energy the weak sunlight provided, while water filtration systems were cobbled together from salvaged parts. The air was thick with the hum of generators and the rhythmic clang of tools, but beneath the surface of progress, a storm was brewing. Mara stood at the center of the growing outpost, her presence a quiet anchor amidst the chaos. She had stepped into the role of leader almost by default, her calm demeanor and sharp mind earning the respect of many, but not everyone was convinced. Jax, her second in command, had always been a man of action, his loyalty to Kael unwavering. Now, with Kael gone, Jax's patience with Mara's measured approach was wearing thin. We need a leader who's willing to make the hard calls, Jax declared, his voice cutting through the noise of construction. He stood a few feet away, his arms crossed and his gaze sharp. The crew paused, their tools falling silent as they turned to watch the confrontation. This isn't a time for hesitation, Mara. The Void's remnants are out there, and they're not going to wait for us to get our act together. Mara met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. And what hard calls are you referring to, Jax? Rushing into decisions without a plan, sacrificing what little we have on a gamble. Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of frustration beneath the surface. We've lost enough. I won't risk what's left of us on reckless moves. Jax stepped closer, his voice rising. You think caution is going to save us? The Void doesn't care about your careful planning. They'll tear us apart while we're still debating the best way to lay down a foundation. He gestured to the crew, his tone growing more urgent. We need someone who's willing to act, not just react. Someone who will put survival above comfort. The tension between them was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken grievances. The crew watched in silence, their loyalties torn. Some nodded in agreement with Jax, their faces set with determination. Others stood by Mara, their trust in her leadership unwavering. The division was clear, and it threatened to fracture the fragile unity they had worked so hard to build. Mara took a deep breath, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. I understand your frustration, Jax. I feel it too, but leadership isn't about making the easy calls. It's about making the right ones. And right now, the right call is to build something that will last, something that will give us a chance, not just for today, but for the future. Jax shook his head, his frustration evident. The future won't matter if we don't survive the next attack. And mark my words, Mara, they're coming. The Void's remnants are out there, and they're watching us. Waiting, as if on cue, a low hum echoed through the outpost, the ground beneath their feet trembling faintly. The crew froze, their eyes darting to the horizon. In the distance, a faint green glow flickered, like the embers of a dying fire. The Void's remnants. Mara's jaw tightened, her gaze locked on the horizon. We'll be ready, she said, her voice firm. But we do this together. No divisions, no infighting. We've already lost too much. If we're going to survive, we need to stand as one. Jax hesitated, his anger giving way to reluctant respect. Then prove it, Mara. Show us you're the leader we need. The crew watched, their breaths held, as the green glow in the distance grew brighter. The shadows of the Void loomed, their presence a grim reminder of the stakes. But amidst the fear, a spark of determination flickered to life. The outpost was more than just a refuge. It was a symbol of their resilience. And as the survivors turned their eyes to Mara, they knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The moon's surface stretched out before Mara, a desolate expanse of gray dust and jagged rock under the pale light of a distant star. She tread carefully, her boots crunching against the lunar soil as she scanned the horizon with a handheld device. The readings had been faint at first, just a blip on the scanner, but as she moved closer, the signal grew stronger, more defined. Something was buried here, something massive. Her breath fogged the visor of her helmet as she approached a jagged fissure in the ground, its edges glowing faintly with an eerie green light. The light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and Mara's stomach tightened with unease. She knelt at the edge, her scanner beeping frantically as it registered the source of the signal. Below her, hidden beneath the moon's surface, was a sprawling network of tunnels and structures, a Void outpost, dormant but intact. This can't be, she muttered, her voice barely audible through the comms. The Void had been destroyed, their fleet obliterated by the singularity generator, or so they had thought. Mara descended into the fissure, her movements cautious but deliberate. The tunnels were eerily silent, their walls smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian. The green light pulsed around her, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. She followed the signal deeper into the outpost, her scanner guiding her to a central chamber. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Rows upon rows of dormant drones filled the chamber, their sleek, insect-like forms arranged in perfect symmetry. They were motionless, their glowing green eyes dark, but Mara could feel the hum of energy in the air, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her hand trembled as she reached for her comms. "Jax, I need you to see this," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Minutes later, Jax joined her in the chamber, his expression grim as he took in the sight. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity. "If these drones awaken, we're done. We don't have the firepower to take them all out." Mara nodded, her mind racing. The Void's not gone. They've been waiting, biding their time. This outpost, it's a contingency plan. a way to rebuild. Jax's jaw tightened as he turned to her, his gaze sharp. If we don't act now, they'll wipe us out. We can't let them wake up. We need to destroy this place before it's too late. Before Mara could respond, the chamber's hum grew louder, the green light pulsing faster. The drones began to stir, their glowing eyes flickering to life, one by one. The ground beneath them trembled as the outpost systems roared back to life, the walls glowing brighter with each passing second. Mara's heart pounded as she grabbed Jax's arm. We need to get out of here, now. The two sprinted through the tunnels, the sound of awakening drones echoing behind them. The outpost was coming alive, its systems reactivating as the drones prepared to launch. Mara's mind raced as they climbed back to the surface, the weight of their discovery pressing down on her. The war wasn't over. The void had been waiting, hidden and patient. And now they were awake. As they emerged onto the moon's surface, Jax turned to Mara, his voice urgent. We need to rally the crew. If we're going to survive this, we need to hit them first. Mara nodded, her resolve hardening. We'll need a plan, and we'll need to move fast. The drones were awake, the void was coming, and the fight for survival had just begun anew. The moon's pale light cast long shadows as Mara and her strike team moved swiftly across the barren surface, their boots kicking up fine clouds of gray dust. The void outpost loomed ahead, its jagged fissure glowing faintly with that same eerie green light she had seen before. The hum of the drones inside was audible even through their helmets, a low, ominous vibration that set her teeth on edge. She adjusted her grip on the pulse rifle in her hands, her voice calm but urgent over the comms. Stay sharp. We hit the central chamber, plant the charges, and get out. No heroics. This isn't the time for them. The team descended into the fissure, their movements precise and deliberate. The tunnels were alive now, the walls pulsing with energy as the drones moved within. Mara's scanner beeped softly, guiding them deeper into the outpost. The central chamber was just ahead, its entrance a gaping maw of darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the drone's eyes. She signaled the team to halt, her voice a whisper over the comms. This is it. Set the charges and move fast. We've got 5 minutes before they detonate. The team moved into the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The drones were awake now, their sleek, insect-like forms shifting restlessly in the shadows. Mara's heart pounded as she set the first charge, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The countdown began, the timer ticking down on her wrist display. But before they could retreat, the drones surged forward, their movements swift and predatory. The team opened fire, the sharp crack of pulse rifles filling the chamber. The drones fell in waves, but for every one they took down, 2 more seemed to take its place. Mara's voice was sharp over the comms. Fall back, get to the tunnels. The team retreated, their movements frantic as the drones closed in. The charges were set, but they were running out of time. Mara glanced at her wrist display. 3 minutes. They wouldn't make it. As they reached the tunnels, the drones were everywhere, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Mara's mind raced. If they didn't act now, the outpost would survive, and the drones would wipe them out. She turned to Jax, her voice steady but urgent. We're not getting out of this, not with the drones on us, but we can still bury this place. Jax nodded, his expression grim. Do it. Mara triggered the charges early, the explosion ripping through the tunnels and collapsing the outpost structure. The ground beneath them shook violently, the ceiling caving in as the drones were crushed beneath tons of rock. The team was thrown to the ground, the world around them a chaotic blur of noise and light. When the dust settled, the outpost was buried, its green glow extinguished. But the tunnels were gone too, sealed off by the cave-in. Mara and her team were trapped, the air growing thin as their oxygen reserves dwindled. Jax's voice crackled over the comms, his tone calm but resigned. "We're not getting out of this one." Mara leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow. She glanced at her team, their faces pale but resolute. They had done what they came to do. The outpost was destroyed, the drones buried, but the cost was steep. As the air grew thinner, Mara's mind drifted to Kael, to the sacrifices they had made, to the future they had fought for. She closed her eyes, her voice a whisper. "We gave them a chance. That's what matters." The comms fell silent, the weight of their sacrifice hanging heavy in the air. The fight for survival had claimed another piece of them, but the spark of hope they had ignited still burned. Somewhere, out there, the survivors would carry on. And that was enough. The air was thick with tension as Mara and Jax sprinted through the moon's jagged terrain, their boots kicking up plumes of gray dust with every step. Behind them, the relentless hum of void drones grew louder, their glowing green eyes piercing the darkness as they closed the distance. Mara's pulse rifle was nearly out of charge, its indicator blinking a warning in the corner of her visor. Jax fired a few wild shots over his shoulder, the crack of his weapon echoing across the barren landscape. "They're not slowing down," he shouted, his voice strained but determined. Mara's mind raced as she scanned the horizon. The new outpost was close, just a few hundred meters ahead. Its lights glimmered faintly in the distance, a fragile beacon of hope against the void's encroaching darkness. "Keep moving," she barked, her tone sharp but steady. "We're almost there." The drones were relentless, their sleek forms gliding effortlessly over the uneven terrain. One of them surged ahead, its claws slashing through the air mere inches from Mara's back. She spun around and fired a burst of plasma, the drone crumpling to the ground in a shower of sparks. But there were dozens more behind it, their movements swift and predatory. As they neared the outpost, Mara's comms crackled to life. "Commander, we've got movement on the perimeter." "What's your status?" It was Reyes, his voice tense with urgency. "We're inbound, but we've got company," Mara replied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Prepare for a breach." Now, the gates of the outpost loomed ahead, their reinforced metal frames a stark contrast to the moon's desolate surface. Mara and Jax dove through the entrance, just as the first wave of drones reached the perimeter. The gates began to close, their heavy hydraulics groaning under the strain. "Seal the gates now," Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The heavy doors slammed shut with a resounding clang, but the drones weren't deterred. Their claws scraped against the metal, their glowing eyes visible through the narrow gaps. Inside the outpost, the survivors scrambled into position, their faces pale but resolute. Reyes and his team manned the barricades, their weapons trained on the gates. Others worked frantically to reinforce the perimeter, their movements fueled by a desperate determination. Mara grabbed Reyes by the shoulder, her voice low but urgent. "We need to hold them off long enough for the charges to detonate. If they breach the gates, it's over." Reyes nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll hold the line, but we're running out of time." The drone's assault was relentless, their claws tearing through the gates with terrifying precision. The survivors opened fire, the sharp crack of pulse rifles filling the air. Drones fell in waves, their broken forms piling up at the gates, but more kept coming. Mara's wrist display beeped softly, the timer counting down. 2 minutes, she muttered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Just 2 more minutes." The gates groaned under the strain, their metal frames bending as the drones forced their way through. A few slipped through the gaps, their claws slashing at the defenders. Mara fired a burst of plasma, taking one down, but another surged forward, its glowing eyes locked on her. Jax tackled it to the ground, his knife glinting in the dim light as he plunged it into the drone's core. "Not today," he growled, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. The outpost was a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and the sharp tang of plasma. The survivors fought with everything they had, their movements fueled by a desperate need to protect what little they had left. Mara's wrist display beeped again 1 minute. She glanced at the gates, her heart pounding. They wouldn't hold much longer. "Fall back to the inner chambers," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We'll make our stand there." The survivors retreated, their movements frantic but deliberate. The drones surged forward, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Mara's mind raced as she reached the inner chambers, her hands flying across the console to arm the charges. The drones were everywhere now, their claws slashing through the air as they closed in. The survivors formed a tight circle, their weapons trained on the encroaching horde. Mara's hand hovered over the detonator, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "For Kael," she whispered. "For all of us." She pressed the button. The explosion tore through the outpost, its blinding light engulfing everything in its path. The drones were obliterated, their broken forms reduced to ash. The survivors stood together, their faces pale but resolute as the dust settled around them. The fight was over, but the war for survival had only just begun. The outpost trembled under the relentless assault of the void drones, their claws tearing through the reinforced gates with terrifying precision. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and the sharp tang of plasma as the survivors fought to hold the line. Mara stood at the center of the chaos, her mind racing as she assessed their dwindling options. The drones were overwhelming, their numbers seemingly endless, and the survivors were running out of time. Amid the chaos, Mara's eyes fell on the power core of the outpost, a massive, glowing structure that fed energy to the entire facility. An idea sparked in her mind, dangerous but necessary. She grabbed Jax by the arm, her voice urgent over the din of battle. "If we overload the core, we can take out the drones in one blast. But it'll mean sacrificing the outpost and anyone inside." Jax's gaze met hers, his expression calm but resolute. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "I'll lead the team to the core. We'll hold the line long enough for you to trigger the overload." Mara's heart clenched at his words, but she knew there was no other choice. "Jax, this is a one-way mission. You don't have to." He cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "This is bigger than any of us. If we don't stop them now, they'll wipe us out. Let me do this for Kael, for all of us." The weight of his decision hung heavy in the air, but there was no time to argue. Mara nodded, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Go and make it count." Jax turned to the team, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. "Listen up, we're heading to the core. Our job is to buy Mara time to overload the system. This is it, our last stand. Let's make it one hell of a fight." The team fell in behind him, their faces grim but determined. They moved swiftly through the outpost, their weapons at the ready as they carved a path through the swarming drones. The corridor leading to the core was a gauntlet of death, the walls slick with the remains of fallen drones, and the air thick with the hum of their relentless advance. As they reached the core chamber, Jax turned to the team, his voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. "This is where we hold the line. No matter what happens, we don't let them through." "Understood." The team nodded, their weapons trained on the entrance as the drones surged forward, Jax took up a position at the front, his pulse rifle blazing as he cut down wave after wave of the relentless machines. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the sharp crack of plasma fire, the sound of their desperate struggle echoing through the chamber. Back in the command center, Mara's hands flew across the console, her movements precise despite the chaos around her. The overload sequence was risky, requiring precise timing and a steady hand. One wrong move and the core could destabilize too early, or not at all. Her heart pounded as she input the final commands, her eyes darting to the timer on her wrist display. "Jax, we've got 2 minutes," she said over the comms, her voice tight with urgency. "Get out of there now." There was a pause, and then Jax's voice crackled through, calm but resolute. "We're not going anywhere. Hold the line, remember. You do what you have to do, Mara. We'll keep them off you." Mara's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't argue. She knew what this meant. Jax and his team weren't coming back. The timer ticked down, the seconds slipping away like grains of sand. Mara's hands trembled as she activated the overload sequence, the core's hum growing louder, more erratic. The drones surged forward, their claws slashing through the air as they closed in on the chamber. Jax's voice came through one last time, his tone steady but filled with quiet pride. "It's been an honor, Commander. Tell them we held the line." The core erupted in a blinding flash of light, the explosion tearing through the outpost and engulfing the drones in a wave of searing energy. The survivors shielded their eyes as the shockwave rippled through the outpost, the force of the blast shaking the ground beneath their feet. When the dust settled, the outpost was gone, its once proud structure reduced to rubble. But so were the drones, their broken forms scattered across the moon's surface. Jax and his team had done it. They had held the line. Mara stood amidst the wreckage, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. The fight for survival had claimed another piece of them, but the spark of hope they had ignited still burned. Somewhere, out there, the survivors would carry on. And that was enough. The outpost lay in ruins, its once proud silhouette now a jagged scar against the moon's barren landscape. Smoke rose in thin, ghostly tendrils from the wreckage, mingling with the faint glow of the void drone's shattered remains. The survivors stood in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. They had won, but the cost had been staggering. Jax and his team were gone, their sacrifice a stark reminder of the price of survival. The air was heavy with the weight of their loss, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the outpost's failing systems. Mara stepped forward, her boots crunching against the debris-strewn ground. Her face was streaked with soot, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. She turned to the survivors, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "We've lost too much to give up now," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "Jax and his team gave us a chance, a future. We owe it to them to keep going, to rebuild, to fight." Her words seemed to ignite a spark in the survivors, their weary eyes flickering with renewed purpose. They had been pushed to the brink, but they were not broken. Slowly, they began to move, their hands reaching for tools and salvaged equipment. The outpost might be gone, but they were still here, and as long as they drew breath, there was hope. As Mara directed the survivors to secure the perimeter and assess their remaining resources, a faint beep echoed through the wreckage. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the survivors' movements. But as she moved closer to the source, the sound grew clearer, a repeating signal, faint but unmistakable. Mara's heart quickened as she traced the signal to a partially intact console buried beneath the rubble. She knelt beside it, her fingers flying across the cracked interface. The screen flickered to life, its glow weak but steady. A message appeared, its text fragmented but clear. "Help us." The words sent a chill through her. She adjusted the console settings, amplifying the signal. The message repeated, its tone urgent and desperate. It wasn't from the void. It wasn't from Earth. It was coming from deep space, a place they had never ventured, a place they had no way of reaching. Mara's mind raced as she processed the implications. If there were others out there, others like them, fighting to survive, then humanity wasn't alone. But the signal's origin was a mystery, its source shrouded in the vast, unknowable expanse of space. She turned to Reyes, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "We've got a signal," she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "It's faint, but it's real. Someone's out there, and they're calling for help." Reyes' eyes widened, his skepticism giving way to cautious hope. "You think it's safe to respond?" Mara hesitated, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The void had taught them the dangers of reaching out, of trusting the unknown, but the signal was different. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea, and if there was even a chance they could help, they had to try. "We'll proceed carefully," she said, her tone firm. "But we can't ignore this. If there's even a possibility of finding allies, of building something stronger than what we've lost, we owe it to ourselves, to everyone we've lost, to answer." The survivors gathered around her, their faces a mix of fear and determination. The signal was a mystery, a risk, but it was also a beacon of hope, a reminder that, even in the darkest corners of the universe, they were not alone. Mara's voice carried across the group, steady but filled with quiet resolve. "We've been through hell, we've lost too much, but this is our chance to turn the tide, to build something new, and we're not going to let it slip away." As the survivors set to work, their movements fueled by a fragile but growing sense of hope, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The signal was a mystery, a challenge, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to rewrite their story. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. Mara stood in the dimly lit command center of the makeshift outpost, her eyes fixed on the flickering console. The signal she had discovered was no longer just a faint whisper in the void. It was a lifeline, a desperate cry for help, from a place they had long believed lost. Her fingers moved swiftly across the interface, decrypting the fragmented message. The words, "Colony Alpha 9, flashed on the screen, sending a jolt through her. It was a name she knew well from the archives, a colony that had vanished decades ago during the height of the Void War. "Alpha 9, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are alive." The revelation sent a ripple of disbelief through the survivors gathered around her. Reyes stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Alpha 9. That's impossible." The void wiped them out. Everyone thought they were gone. Mara shook her head, her tone firm. "The signal's real, and it's coming from their last known coordinates. They've been holding out all this time, hidden somewhere in the void." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. A colony thought lost, now reaching out for help. It was a chance to save lives, to reclaim a piece of humanity's shattered past. But it was also a risk, one that could cost them everything. Mara turned to the survivors, her expression a mix of determination and hesitation. "We've barely stabilized here, sending a team out there. It's dangerous. The void's remnants are still out there, and we don't know what we'll find. But if we don't act, those people won't stand a chance." Before she could continue, a voice cut through the silence. "We can't leave them behind." It was Tessa, a young engineer who had lost her family in the war. Her eyes burned with conviction as she stepped forward. "We've lost too much already. If there's even a chance to save someone, we have to take it." Others nodded in agreement, their faces set with resolve. Reyes crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. "And what if it's a trap? The void's been quiet, but that doesn't mean they're gone. We could be walking into a slaughter." Mara's gaze softened as she looked at him. "I know the risks, but if we don't try, we'll never forgive ourselves. And besides," she added, her voice steady, "if Alpha 9 survived this long, they might have resources, technology, supplies, anything that could help us rebuild." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, the survivors' fear giving way to a fragile hope. Mara's mind raced as she began to outline the plan. The rescue mission would require precision and stealth. They couldn't afford to draw the Void's attention, not when their outpost was still so vulnerable. "We'll take the fastest shuttle," she said, her tone commanding yet calm. "A small team, no more than 5. We'll move quickly, get in and out before the Void even knows we're there." Reyes stepped forward, his skepticism replaced by a quiet determination. "I'll lead the team. If this goes south, you'll need someone who knows how to handle the Void." Mara hesitated, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. But she nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Be careful. We've lost enough already." As the survivors prepared for the mission, the air was thick with anticipation. The signal from Alpha 9 was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, humanity could endure. But it was also a reminder of the cost of the sacrifices they had made, and the ones they might still have to make. Mara stood at the edge of the outpost, watching as the shuttle prepared for launch. The void stretched out before her, vast and unknowable, but somewhere out there, a colony was waiting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could bring them home. The shuttle's engines roared as it descended through the thick, swirling atmosphere of Alpha 9. The colony's surface, obscured by a dense, green-tinged fog. Mara gripped the controls tightly, her knuckles white as the vessel shuddered violently. The scanners had shown no signs of life on approach, only the faint, erratic energy signatures of void remnants scattered across the ruins. Now, as they broke through the fog, the devastation came into view: shattered buildings, scorched earth, and the skeletal remains of a once thriving colony. No sign of the survivors, Reyes muttered from the co-pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the landscape. If they're here, they're buried deep. Mara set the shuttle down on the edge of the colony, its landing gear groaning under the weight of the debris-strewn ground. The team moved quickly, their weapons drawn as they stepped into the eerie silence. The air was thick with the acrid stench of decay and the faint hum of void energy, a constant reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. The ruins were a maze of crumbling structures and shattered infrastructure, the remnants of a civilization that had fought and lost against the void. As the team pressed deeper, the faint sound of movement caught Mara's attention. She signaled for silence, her pulse rifle raised as she followed the noise to a partially collapsed building. Inside, hidden beneath a pile of rubble, was a group of survivors. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. One of them, a woman with a bloodied bandage wrapped around her arm, locked eyes with Mara and whispered, "They're not just machines, they're evolving." The words sent a chill through Mara. She knelt beside the woman, her voice low but urgent. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" The survivor's voice trembled as she spoke. "The void, they're not like they were before. They've started to adapt, to learn. They've been hunting us, not just destroying. They've become smarter." Mara's mind raced as she processed the implications. The void had always been relentless, But if they were truly evolving, it changed everything. Their tactics, their strategies. They would need to rethink everything. Before she could ask more, the sound of scraping metal echoed through the ruins. The team tensed, their weapons trained on the shadows as the unmistakable hum of void drones filled the air. The survivors huddled closer, their fear palpable. "We need to move," Reyes said, his voice tight with urgency. "If they're evolving, we're sitting ducks here." Mara nodded, her resolve hardening. She turned to the survivors, her voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "We're getting you out of here. But you need to trust us. Can you move?" The woman nodded weakly, her grip tightening on Mara's arm. "We'll follow you." As the team prepared to retreat, the drones closed in, their movements swift and calculated. Unlike before, they didn't charge blindly. They flanked, they strategized, their glowing eyes scanning the survivors with an almost predatory intelligence. Mara's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The survivor was right. The void wasn't just adapting, they were learning, and if they didn't act fast, they wouldn't just lose the colony. They'd lose the war. The team moved quickly, their movements precise as they ushered the survivors toward the shuttle. The drones followed, their hum growing louder, more menacing. Mara's mind raced, searching for a way to outsmart them, but the void was no longer the enemy they knew. As the shuttle's engines roared to life, Mara glanced back at the ruins, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had discovered. The fight for survival had just become infinitely more complicated, and as the void closed in, she knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time to adapt. The shuttle lifted off, its thrusters kicking up clouds of dust as it ascended through the fog. Below, the drones watched, their glowing eyes tracking the vessel's movements. The colony was lost, but the survivors were safe. For now, Mara's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her mind already racing with the implications of what they had learned. The void was evolving, and if humanity didn't evolve with them, they wouldn't stand a chance. The shuttle shuddered violently as it tore through the thick atmosphere of Alpha 9, its engines straining against the gravitational pull. Mara clenched the controls, her focus razor sharp as she navigated through the debris-strewn sky. Behind her, the survivors huddled together, their faces pale but resolute. The faint hum of void drones echoed through the ship's hull, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. "They're still on us," Reyes muttered, his eyes glued to the rear scanner. The screen flickered with red dots, dozens of them, their movements unnervingly precise. "They're not just chasing us, they're hurting us." Mara's jaw tightened as she adjusted their trajectory, the shuttle dipping sharply to avoid a cluster of floating wreckage. The void drones were relentless, their sleek forms cutting through the fog with terrifying speed. But it wasn't just their numbers that worried her. It was the way they moved, coordinated, calculated, as if they were working together, learning from every maneuver. "Hold on," she warned, her voice calm but urgent. The shuttle banked hard to the left, its thrusters roaring as it narrowly avoided a collision with a massive fragment of the colony's ruined infrastructure. The survivors gripped their seats, their breath held as the vessel stabilized. "We can't keep this up forever," Reyes said, his tone grim. "We need to lose them fast." Mara's mind raced as she scanned the terrain below. The colony's surface was a labyrinth of jagged ruins and deep chasms, the remnants of a civilization that had fought and lost against the void. She spotted a narrow canyon, its walls towering and shadowed, and made a split-second decision. "We're going in," she said, her voice steady. The shuttle plunged into the canyon, its engines roaring as it skimmed just meters above the rugged ground. The void drones followed, their movements swift but less agile in the tight confines. Mara's hands moved with precision, her every adjustment calculated to outmaneuver their pursuers. "They are falling back," Reyes reported, his voice tinged with relief. But Mara's relief was short-lived. The canyon ended abruptly, opening into a vast, debris-filled plain. And there, waiting for them, was the Void Fleet. The sight was enough to make even the most hardened survivor falter. Dozens of sleek, angular ships loomed in the distance, their hulls glinting faintly in the pale light. The drones they had been evading were nothing compared to this, a coordinated force, their movements synchronized with chilling precision. "We're not going to outrun them," Mara said, her voice low but resolute. "But we're not giving up." She activated the shuttle's comms, her fingers flying across the console. The outpost's frequency crackled to life, and she spoke, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This is Commander Mara. We're coming home, but we're not alone. The Void Fleet is on our tail. Prepare for immediate defense." The survivors exchanged tense glances, their fear palpable. But Mara's calm demeanor was a lifeline, her quiet strength, a reminder of why they had followed her this far. As the shuttle broke free of the canyon, the Void Fleet surged forward, their weapons charging with an ominous hum. Mara's hand hovered over the thrusters, her mind racing with the weight of their situation. They had survived the impossible before. They could do it again. The shuttle's engines roared as it streaked toward the outpost, the Void Fleet hot on its heels. The fight for survival had entered a new, more dangerous phase. And as the stars blurred past, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The outpost's lights glimmered faintly in the distance, a fragile beacon of hope against the void's encroaching darkness. They were almost home, but the real battle was just ahead. The outpost buzzed with frantic energy as the survivors scrambled to fortify their defenses. The once sturdy walls, already battered from previous battles, now bore fresh scars from the Void's relentless assault. Supplies were dwindling, ammunition was scarce, energy reserves were critically low, and the medical bay overflowed with the wounded. The air was thick with tension, each breath a reminder of how close they were to the edge. Mara stood in the command center, her eyes scanning the holographic display that flickered with the Void Fleet's approach. The swarm of red dots was closing in, their movements calculated and precise. She clenched her fists, her mind racing through their dwindling options. They couldn't outrun the Void, and they couldn't outlast them, not like this. "We need a plan," Reyes said, his voice breaking the silence. "If we just keep defending, they'll wear us down." "We're running out of time." Mara's gaze hardened as she turned to face the survivors gathered around her. "We're not just defending anymore," she said, her tone steady but laced with quiet determination. "We're going to end this, one way or another." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mara stepped forward, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her crew. "The Void's strength is in their numbers, their ability to overwhelm us, but they're predictable. They follow patterns, even as they evolve. If we can lure them into a trap, we can turn their own tactics against them." She moved to the console, her fingers tapping swiftly as she pulled up a map of the surrounding terrain. "There's a narrow pass about 5 clicks from here. If we can draw the fleet into it, we'll have the high ground. We'll funnel them into a kill zone." Reyes frowned, his skepticism evident. "And how do you plan to get them to follow us?" "They're not exactly known for falling into traps." Mara's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "We give them something they can't resist. Us. We send a decoy team to draw them in. Make them think we're vulnerable, that we're retreating. They'll take the bait." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, the risks of the plan clear. But Mara's confidence was unwavering. "This is our only shot. If we don't act now, they'll tear us apart. But if we do this right, we can cripple their fleet, buy ourselves the time we need to regroup and rebuild." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, the survivors' fear giving way to a fragile sense of hope. They began to move, their movements fueled by a desperate determination. Weapons were distributed, defenses were reinforced, and the decoy team prepared for their perilous mission. As the outpost buzzed with activity, Mara stepped outside, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The Void Fleet loomed in the distance, their dark silhouettes a stark reminder of the stakes. She took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. This was it, their last stand. "This ends here," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of preparations. One way or another, the survivors moved into position, their faces set with grim resolve. The decoy team launched, their shuttles streaking toward the Void Fleet in a daring act of defiance. The trap was set, and as the first shots rang out, Mara couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options, but they were still here, and as long as they were still fighting, there was a chance. The battle for survival had reached its climax. And as the void closed in, Mara knew one thing for certain: they weren't going down without a fight. The Void Fleet descended like a storm, their sleek, angular ships cutting through the void with terrifying precision. The outpost sensors blared with warnings, the holographic display flickering red as the enemy closed in. Mara stood at the command center, her eyes locked on the swarm of red dots, converging on their position. The trap was set, and now it was time to spring it. "All teams, hold your positions," Mara commanded, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "Wait for my signal." The decoy team had done their job well, luring the Void Fleet into the narrow pass where the outpost's defenses were strongest. The enemy ships, overconfident in their overwhelming numbers, had taken the bait. Now they were funneled into a kill zone, their movements restricted by the canyon's towering walls. Mara's hand hovered over the console, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for the perfect moment. The void ships were almost in position, their weapons charging with an ominous hum. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she gave the order, "Now." The outpost's defenses roared to life, a barrage of plasma fire and EMP pulses tearing through the Void Fleet. The canyon lit up with explosions, the enemy ships crumpling under the onslaught. The survivors cheered as the holographic display showed the red dots disappearing one by one, their once formidable fleet reduced to smoldering wreckage. But Mara's relief was short-lived. Amid the chaos, one ship remained a massive angular vessel that loomed over the battlefield like a predator stalking its prey. The Harbinger's flagship. "They're not retreating," Reyes said, his voice tense. "That thing's still out there." Mara's jaw tightened as she studied the holographic display. The Harbinger's ship was unlike anything they had faced before. Its hull glinted with an unnatural sheen, its weapons pulsing with a sickly green light. It was a fortress, a symbol of the Void's relentless power, and it wasn't going down without a fight. "We're not done yet," Mara said, her tone resolute. "That ship is the key. If we take it down, we cripple the Void's command structure, but we're running out of time." The outpost's defenses were faltering, their energy reserves dwindling with every passing second. The survivors worked frantically to keep the systems online, but the strain was evident. The shields flickered precariously, their faint blue glow sputtering like a dying flame. Mara turned to the survivors, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We've fought too hard to give up now. That ship is our target. We hit it with everything we've got, and we don't stop until it's gone." The crew moved into position, their faces set with grim determination. The Harbinger's flagship loomed larger on the holographic display, its weapons charging for another attack. Mara's mind raced, her every instinct screaming at her to find a way to turn the tide. As the Void's flagship unleashed its first barrage, the outpost shuddered violently, its hull groaning under the strain. Mara's hands flew across the console, her movements precise as she rerouted power to the shields. But she knew it wasn't enough. They needed a plan. Something bold, something risky. Her eyes fell on the singularity generator, its dormant form, a reminder of their last, desperate stand. It was a weapon of immense power, capable of delivering a crippling blow. But using it would drain the outpost's core completely, leaving them defenseless. Mara's voice was steady as she made the call. Prep the singularity generator. We've got one shot. Make it count. The crew scrambled to carry out her orders, their movements fueled by a desperate determination. The Harbinger's flagship loomed closer, its weapons fully charged and ready to strike. The fight for survival had reached its climax, and as the outpost systems strained under the weight of the battle, Mara knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over until the Harbinger's ship was gone. The singularity generator hummed to life, its energy core pulsing faster and faster. The Harbinger's flagship hesitated, its movements faltering as it sensed the impending threat. Mara's hand hovered over the activation switch, her heart pounding in her chest. For Kael, she whispered. For all of us. She pressed the button. The generator unleashed a blinding beam of energy, streaking toward the Harbinger's flagship with unerring precision. For a moment, the void was illuminated, the beam striking the enemy vessel's hull with a deafening crack. The flagship shuddered, its systems flickering as its defenses faltered. But it wasn't enough. The Harbinger's ship was damaged, but it wasn't destroyed. Its lights dimmed, but it didn't stop. It continued its relentless advance, its weapons slowly powering up once more. Mara's voice was barely above a whisper, her words heavy with dread. Commander, what do we do now? Kael's eyes hardened, his resolve unshaken. We fight, he said simply. Until the last breath, until the last drop of power, we fight. The outpost systems groaned under the strain, their lights flickering ominously. The Harbinger's flagship loomed closer, its weapons fully charged and ready to strike. The fight for survival had reached its climax, and as the outpost systems strained under the weight of the battle, Mara knew one thing for certain. They weren't going down without a fight. The shuttle shuddered violently as it docked with the Harbinger's flagship, its magnetic clamps groaning under the strain. Mara adjusted her helmet, the faint hiss of a rebreather, the only sound in the cramped interior. Behind her, the boarding party stood ready, their faces hidden behind reflective visors, but their tension palpable. Each of them knew the stakes. This wasn't just a mission, it was a last, desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. Stay close, Mara ordered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We hit the core, plant the charges, and get out. No detours. No heroics. The hatch hissed open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior of the void ship. The air was thick with an unnatural hum, the walls shimmering with an iridescent black sheen. The boarding party moved quickly, their boots clanging against the metal floor as they advanced. The drones were already converging, their glowing green eyes cutting through the gloom. The first wave hit hard, their movements swift and predatory. Mara's pulse rifle blazed, the sharp crack of plasma fire echoing through the corridors. The drones fell in waves, but for every one they took down, two more seemed to take its place. The boarding party fought with everything they had, their movements precise but frantic, as they carved a path through the relentless machines. Keep moving, Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not stopping until we reach the core." The corridors seemed endless, a labyrinth of twisting passages and darkened chambers. The drones were everywhere, their hum growing louder, more menacing, but the boarding party pressed on, their determination unshaken. Every step brought them closer to the core, closer to the heart of the void's power. Finally, they reached it, the core chamber, a massive, pulsating structure that throbbed with an eerie green light. The air around it crackled with energy, the hum almost deafening. Mara's hands flew across the interface, her fingers working quickly to plant the charges. The timer began to count down, its soft beep a stark contrast to the chaos around them. But before they could retreat, a figure stepped into the chamber. Tall and cloaked in flowing black robes, the Harbinger's presence was suffocating, its mask absorbing the light around it. "You cannot win," it said, its voice a low, resonant hum that reverberated in Mara's chest. "You are only delaying the inevitable." Mara's jaw tightened as she turned to face the Harbinger, her pulse rifle raised. "We'll see about that." The Harbinger's mask tilted slightly, its tone almost mocking. "Your defiance is admirable, but futile. The void cannot be stopped. It is the end of all things." Before Mara could respond, the ship shuddered violently, the hum of the core growing erratic. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the ship's self-destruct sequence initiating. The Harbinger's voice was calm, almost serene. "This ship is but one of many. The void will endure, and you will be erased." Mara's heart pounded as she glanced at the timer on her wrist display. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the ship exploded. She turned to the boarding party, her voice sharp with urgency. "Fall back now." The team sprinted through the corridors, the drones surging forward in a final, desperate attempt to stop them. The ship groaned under the strain, its hull buckling as the self-destruct sequence reached its climax. The boarding party fought their way back to the shuttle, their movements fueled by sheer willpower. As the shuttle launched, the Harbinger's flagship erupted in a blinding flash of light, its core collapsing in a wave of searing energy. The shockwave rocked the shuttle, its thrusters roaring as it struggled to stabilize. Mara glanced back at the explosion, her breath catching in her throat. The Harbinger was gone, but the fight wasn't over. The void was still out there, its relentless advance unyielding. And as the shuttle streaked toward the outpost, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. "We're not done yet," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Not by a long shot. The shuttle disappeared into the void, its tiny light a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. The fight for survival had entered a new phase, and Mara knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. The Harbinger's flagship groaned under the strain of its failing core, the once imposing vessel now a crumbling shadow of its former self. Mara sprinted through the twisting corridors, her pulse rifle slung over her shoulder, and the timer on her wrist display ticking down relentlessly. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and the faint hum of void energy, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. Behind her, the boarding team followed closely, their movements swift but deliberate as they navigated the labyrinthine ship. The core chamber was just ahead, its massive structure pulsating with an eerie green light. The Harbinger's voice echoed through the corridors, its tone calm but laced with menace. "You cannot escape your fate, Commander. The void is eternal. Your efforts are futile." Mara ignored the taunt, her focus locked on the task at hand. She reached the core and began inputting the final commands, her fingers flying across the interface. The timer on her wrist display beeped softly, the countdown nearing its end. "Charges set," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We've got 2 minutes, move." The team turned and ran, their boots pounding against the metal floor as they retraced their path through the ship. The drones were everywhere now, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness as they converged on the intruders. Mara fired a burst of plasma, taking down a drone that lunged at her, but more surged forward, their movements swift and predatory. The ship shuddered violently, the walls groaning as the core's energy destabilized. The hum grew louder, more erratic, the air crackling with tension. Mara's heart pounded as she glanced at her wrist display. 1 minute. They weren't going to make it. "This way," Reyes shouted, veering down a side corridor. The team followed, their movements frantic as they carved a path through the drones. The shuttle was just ahead, its hatch open and waiting. Mara dove inside, the rest of the team close behind. The hatch hissed shut, and the shuttle's engines roared to life, its thrusters kicking up clouds of dust as it ascended through the ship's crumbling hull. Behind them, the Harbinger's flagship began to collapse, its massive structure buckling under the strain of the core's instability. The shuttle streaked away, its thrusters screaming as it fought against the ship's gravitational pull. Mara glanced back, her breath catching in her throat as the flagship erupted in a blinding flash of light, its core collapsing in a wave of searing energy. The shockwave rocked the shuttle, its thrusters sputtering as it struggled to stabilize. The void was illuminated by the explosion, the Harbinger's flagship reduced to a fiery streak across the sky before disintegrating into nothingness. As the shuttle's system stabilized, the comms crackled to life. "Commander, we're reading no void signatures, the fleet. It's gone." The words hung in the air for a moment before the survivors erupted into cheers, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. "We did it," someone shouted, their tone filled with disbelief. "We're free." Mara leaned back in her seat, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. The fight had been long and brutal, but they had won. The void was gone, their relentless advance finally halted. But as the shuttle streaked toward the outpost, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The war had changed them all, and the scars it left behind would take time to heal. For now, though, there was hope, and as the survivors celebrated their hard-fought victory, Mara allowed herself a faint smile. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, and as long as they drew breath, humanity would endure. The outpost was a shadow of its former self, its once proud walls now scarred and battered from the relentless battles with the void. Yet, amidst the wreckage, there was a flicker of life, a quiet determination that pulsed through the survivors as they began the arduous task of rebuilding. The air buzzed with the sound of tools clanging against metal, the hum of generators coming back online, and the occasional murmur of voices working in unison. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. Mara stood at the edge of the command center, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Her hands were calloused, her body weary from the endless strain of leadership, but her mind remained sharp. She could feel the weight of their losses pressing down on her, every face that was no longer there, every voice silenced by the void's relentless advance. Kael's absence was especially heavy, a constant ache in her chest. She could still hear his voice, steady and resolute, urging her to keep going even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "We owe it to them to keep going," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the din of activity. The words were a reminder, not just to herself, but to everyone around her. They had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let despair take hold now. The survivors looked to her for guidance, their eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and hope. They had been through hell battling the void, losing friends and family, and scraping by with dwindling resources. Yet, there was a quiet resilience in their movements, a determination to honor those who had fallen by building something new. Mara stepped forward, her presence a calming anchor amidst the chaos. "We've faced the worst of it," she said, her voice carrying across the group, "but we're still here. And as long as we're still here, we have a chance to rebuild, to make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain." The survivors nodded, their resolve hardening. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still supplies to secure, defenses to reinforce, and wounds to heal, both physical and emotional. But they had each other, and that was enough to keep them going. As the work continued, Mara found herself reflecting on Kael's sacrifice. He had given everything to ensure their survival, his final moments a testament to his unwavering courage. She could still see the flash of light as the singularity generator detonated, the void fleet disintegrating into nothingness. It had been a costly victory, but it had given them a future. "We're not just rebuilding for ourselves," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "We're rebuilding for everyone we've lost, for Kael, for all of them. And we're going to make it count." The survivors paused, their tools resting in their hands as they turned to her. There was a quiet strength in their silence, a shared understanding of what they had endured and what still lay ahead. They were battered, but not broken, and as long as they stood together, they could face whatever came next. Mara's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the faint glow of a distant star flickered like a beacon. The void was gone, but the scars they had left behind would take time to heal. And as the survivors continued their work, their movements fueled by a fragile but growing sense of hope, Mara couldn't help but feel that they were building more than just an outpost. They were building a legacy, one that would endure long after the void was nothing more than a distant memory. The fight for survival had changed them, but it hadn't broken them. And as long as they kept moving forward, they would honor the sacrifices of those who had given everything to keep the flame of humanity alive. The outpost's command center was a hive of quiet activity, the faint hum of systems rebooting, and the occasional beep of consoles filling the air. Mara stood at the center of it all, her eyes fixed on the holographic display as it flickered with data streams. The survivors had been working tirelessly to restore the station's functionality, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of cautious optimism. That was when Aegis' voice cut through the calm, its tone calm but urgent. "Commander, I've detected an anomalous signal," Aegis announced, the holographic display shifting to show a faint, pulsing beacon. "It appears to be originating from a colony ship, one that predates the Void War." Mara's brow furrowed as she stepped closer to the display, her mind racing. "A colony ship? How is that possible? We thought all pre-war vessels were lost or destroyed." The AI's response was measured, its holographic interface glowing faintly as it analyzed the data. "The ship's trajectory suggests it was launched during the early stages of the war, possibly as part of a last-ditch effort to preserve humanity. Its systems have been dormant until now, but it appears to have recently activated a distress beacon." The room fell silent as the implications of Aegis' discovery sank in. A colony ship from before the Void War, a relic from a time when humanity still had hope of spreading beyond the stars. It was a piece of their past, a reminder of what they had once aspired to be, but it was also a potential lifeline, a chance to reunite with others who might have survived the war. Mara's mind raced as she weighed the possibilities. The survivors were still struggling to rebuild, their resources stretched thin and their defenses precarious. Pursuing the signal would mean diverting precious time and energy, and there was no guarantee the ship would even be intact, let alone habitable. But the thought of leaving it unanswered gnawed at her. If there were survivors out there, they deserved a chance. Before she could voice her thoughts, Reyes stepped forward, his expression resolute. "We have to go after it," he said, his voice firm. "If there's even a chance that someone's out there, we can't just leave them to fend for themselves. It's our duty to find them." The sentiment was echoed by the other survivors, their voices rising in agreement. "We've lost too much to turn our backs now," one of them said, their tone filled with quiet determination. "If we don't help them, who will?" Mara looked around the room, her gaze meeting the eyes of each survivor. They had been through hell together, fought side by side against the void, and endured losses that would have broken lesser people. And now, they were asking her to take another risk, not for themselves, but for others who might need their help. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "We'll go after the signal, but we do this carefully. We've come too far to throw it all away on a gamble." The survivors sprang into action, their movements fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. Supplies were gathered, the shuttle was prepped, and Aegis worked tirelessly to refine the signal's coordinates. The journey ahead would be fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, not just for themselves, but for the possibility of a larger, stronger humanity. As the shuttle's engines roared to life, Mara stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the stars. The void had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken their humanity. And as long as they held onto that, they could face whatever lay ahead. The signal was a mystery, a call from the past that might hold the key to their future. And as the shuttle streaked into the void, Mara couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild not just their lives, but their legacy. The shuttle glided silently through the void, its engines muted as it approached the derelict colony ship. The vessel loomed ahead, its massive silhouette a stark contrast to the infinite blackness of space. Its hull was scarred and pitted, the faint remnants of its once bright insignia barely visible under layers of grime and decay. The ship's lights were dark, its engines silent, and its atmosphere, or lack thereof, suggested it had been adrift for decades, maybe longer. Mara stood at the shuttle's viewport, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. The sight of the colony ship sent a chill through her. It was a relic from a time before the Void War, a time when humanity still dreamed of spreading its reach across the stars. But now it was a ghost, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. No signs of life, Reyes reported from the co-pilot's seat, his eyes fixed on the scanner. No energy signatures, no movement, just silence. Mara nodded, her jaw tightening. "We're going in, suit up." The boarding team moved quickly, their movements precise despite the weight of the situation. They docked with the colony ship, the sound of the airlock hissing open the only noise in the otherwise eerie stillness. The interior was dark, the air thick with the scent of decay and the faint metallic tang of old machinery. The team's helmet lights cut through the gloom, revealing corridors lined with rusted bulkheads and shattered consoles. As they moved deeper into the ship, the silence grew heavier, the only sound the rhythmic clang of their boots against the metal floor. Mara's scanner picked up faint traces of residual energy, leading them to the ship's command center. The door was jammed, its mechanisms long since corroded, but a few well-placed charges from Rey's toolkit forced it open with a deafening clang. Inside, the command center was a graveyard of forgotten technology. The holographic displays were dark, the consoles covered in a thick layer of dust. But in the center of the room, a single console flickered faintly, its screen casting a pale blue glow across the room. Mara approached it cautiously, her gloved fingers brushing away the dust to reveal a control panel. "There's a recording," she said, her voice low. "It's still active." She pressed a button, and the console crackled to life. A grainy hologram materialized, the image of a man in a tattered uniform appearing before them. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "This is Captain Elias Renner of the colony ship, Elysium's Dawn." The recording began, the man's voice trembling but steady. "We tried to escape. We thought we could outrun the void, find a new home far from the war, but they found us. They always find us." The image flickered, the captain's face distorting as the recording skipped. "We don't have much time. The void breached the hull hours ago. They are in the corridors, in the walls. We sealed off the command center, but it's only a matter of time before they break through. If anyone finds this, tell them we fought. Tell them we didn't give up. But the void, they're not what we thought. They're not just machines. They're something else. Something worse." The recording ended abruptly, the hologram dissolving into static. The room fell silent, the weight of the captain's words pressing down on them. Mara's mind raced, the implications of what she had just heard sending a chill through her. The void wasn't just a weapon or a force of destruction. It was something more, something they still didn't fully understand. Before she could process the revelation, a faint sound echoed through the corridors, a low, rhythmic scraping, like metal against metal. The team froze, their weapons raised as they scanned the shadows. "Movement," Reyes whispered, his voice barely audible over the comms. 12 o'clock. Mara's heart pounded as she turned, her helmet light illuminating the corridor. The shadows seemed to shift, their edges blurring as something moved within them. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. "Fall back," Mara ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. Now, the team retreated, their movements swift but deliberate as they made their way back to the shuttle. The shadows followed, their presence a constant reminder of the danger closing in. As they reached the airlock, Mara glanced back at the colony ship, her mind racing with questions. The void had taken the Elysium's Dawn, just as it had taken so many others. But what it had left behind was more than just wreckage. It was a warning, and as the shuttle pulled away from the derelict ship, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to uncover the true nature of the enemy they faced. The shuttle's airlock hissed shut behind them, sealing Mara and her team inside, just as the first of the void remnants emerged from the shadows. The creatures were unlike anything she had encountered before, sleek, almost organic in appearance, their forms shifting fluidly as they moved. Their glowing green eyes pulsed with an unsettling intelligence, and their movements were deliberate, calculated. "Stay sharp," Mara warned, her pulse rifle raised and ready. "These aren't the drones we're used to. They're different." The team moved cautiously through the shuttle's narrow corridors, their helmet lights cutting through the darkness. The void remnants followed, their low, rhythmic hum growing louder with every step. Mara's scanner beeped frantically, its readings erratic as it struggled to make sense of the creature's energy signatures. Aegis' voice crackled over the comms, its tone calm but tinged with urgency. "Commander, I've analyzed the remnants' behavior. They've evolved beyond their original programming. Their movements suggest a level of adaptability and coordination we've never seen before." Mara's jaw tightened as she processed the AI's words. The void had always been relentless, but this was something new. The remnants weren't just mindless machines following predetermined patterns. They were learning, adapting, becoming something more. The first attack came without warning. One of the remnants surged forward, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. Mara reacted instinctively, firing a burst of plasma that struck the creature square in the chest. It crumpled to the ground, its form dissolving into a pool of black, viscous liquid. But the victory was short-lived. More remnants surged forward, their movements swift and coordinated. The team fought back with everything they had, their weapons blazing as they carved a path through the relentless horde. The shuttle's corridors were soon littered with the remains of the creatures, but for every one they took down, 2 more seemed to take its place. "We can't keep this up," Reyes shouted, his voice strained as he fired another burst of plasma. "They're too fast, too many." Mara's mind raced as she searched for a way to turn the tide. The remnants were overwhelming them, their numbers and adaptability making them a far greater threat than the drones they had faced before. And then it hit her, the shuttle's power core. "Aegis, can we overload the core?" she asked, her voice sharp with urgency. The AI's response was immediate. "Overloading the core will create an energy surge capable of neutralizing the remnants. However, it will also render the shuttle inoperable." Mara didn't hesitate. "Do it. We'll take the escape pods." The team moved quickly, their movements fueled by desperation as they made their way to the escape pods. The remnants followed, their hum growing louder, more menacing. Mara's heart pounded as she input the final commands, the shuttle's core pulsing faster and faster as it prepared to overload. "Now," she shouted, diving into the escape pod. The hatch hissed shut, and the pod launched, its thrusters roaring as it streaked away from the shuttle. Behind them, the shuttle's core erupted in a blinding flash of light, the energy surge engulfing the remnants in a wave of searing energy. The creatures dissolved into nothingness, their forms disintegrating under the intense heat. As the escape pods stabilized, Mara allowed herself a moment to catch her breath. The remnants were gone, but the implications of what she had just witnessed weighed heavily on her mind. The void wasn't just evolving, it was becoming something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. Aegis' voice broke the silence, its tone calm, but filled with quiet resolve. "The void's evolution poses a significant threat. If they continue to adapt at this rate, our current strategies may no longer be effective." Mara nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars. The fight wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase, and as long as the void continued to evolve, humanity's survival would hang in the balance. The escape pods streaked toward the outpost, their tiny lights a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. The remnants were gone, but the void's threat remained, a reminder that the war for survival was far from over. And as Mara stared out into the void, she knew one thing for certain: they would need to evolve too, if they were going to stand a chance. The shuttle's escape pod docked with the outpost, its hatch hissing open to reveal Mara and her team, their faces pale but resolute. The weight of what they had just witnessed hung heavy in the air. Void remnants that were faster, smarter, and more coordinated than anything they had faced before. But amidst the tension, there was a glimmer of hope. In Mara's hands was a data drive salvaged from the derelict colony ship, its contents a potential key to understanding the void's evolution. The command center buzzed with activity as Mara connected the drive to the outpost systems. The holographic display flickered to life, its glow casting long shadows across the room. The data streamed in, fragmented and corrupted, but slowly, a picture began to emerge. This isn't just a colony ship's log," Mara murmured, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the information. "It's a map to avoid Stronghold." The room fell silent as the holographic display zoomed in on a sector of space far beyond their current reach. The coordinates were clear, the energy signatures unmistakable. The void wasn't just evolving, they were consolidating their forces, building something far more dangerous than a simple outpost. Reyes stepped forward, his expression grim. If they're building a stronghold, it's only a matter of time before they launch another attack. We can't let them regroup. The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They had just barely survived their last encounter with the Void remnants. Pursuing a stronghold, a fortified, heavily guarded base, was a risk they might not survive. Mara's voice cut through the tension, her tone steady but filled with quiet resolve. This isn't just about us. If the Void is building a stronghold, it's not just a threat to this outpost, it's a threat to anyone who's still out there. To anyone who might still be fighting. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, but there were dissenting voices too. We're barely holding on as it is, one of the survivors argued, their frustration evident. If we throw everything into one last mission and fail, there won't be anything left to fight for. Mara nodded, her gaze softening as she addressed the group. I know the risks, but if we don't act now, the Void will only grow stronger. We've faced impossible odds before, and we've come out on top. This time won't be any different. The survivors fell silent, their fear giving way to a fragile sense of determination. Reyes stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. We can't let them rebuild, not after everything we've lost, not after everything we've fought for. The sentiment was echoed by the others, their voices rising in agreement. They had come too far to turn back now. The Void had taken too much from them. Their homes, their families, their hope, but they were still here, still fighting. And as long as they drew breath, they would keep fighting. Mara turned back to the holographic display, her mind already racing with the logistics of the mission. The stronghold was deep in Void-controlled space, its defenses formidable. They would need every resource, every weapon, every ounce of courage they had left. But they had something the Void didn't, something that had kept them going through the darkest days of the war. They had each other. As the survivors prepared for what might be their final mission, Mara couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but it was also a chance to strike back, to show the Void that humanity wasn't just surviving, they were fighting. And they weren't done yet. The shuttle glided silently through the Void, its engines muted as it approached the Void stronghold. The massive structure loomed ahead, its jagged, angular design casting long shadows across the surrounding debris field. The stronghold was unlike anything they had ever seen, a fortress of blackened metal and pulsating green light, its defenses bristling with an array of turrets, drones, and energy shields. It was a monument to the Void's relentless ambition, a chilling reminder of the enemy they faced. Mara stood at the shuttle's viewport, her eyes scanning the stronghold's defenses. The survivors behind her were silent, their faces pale but resolute. They had come this far, fought through impossible odds, and now they stood on the precipice of their final battle. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but Mara's voice cut through the tension, steady and commanding. "This is it," she said, her tone firm but laced with quiet determination. "The end of the Void. We've faced them before, but this is different. This is their heart. If we take it down, we cripple them for good." The holographic display flickered to life, projecting a detailed map of the stronghold's layout. Mara's hands moved swiftly across the interface, highlighting key points of interest, weak spots in the energy shields, blind spots in the turret coverage, and potential entry points. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan, her every calculation precise and deliberate. "We'll split into 2 teams," she began, her voice carrying across the shuttle's cramped interior. "Team 1 will create a diversion, drawing their fire and pulling their defenses away from the main entrance. Team 2 will infiltrate the stronghold and plant the charges. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we don't stop until the job is done. The survivors nodded, their movements fueled by a mix of fear and determination. They knew the risks. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was their last, desperate gamble to end the war. As the shuttle moved into position, Mara turned to Reyes, her second in command. You'll lead Team 1. Keep them busy as long as you can, but don't take unnecessary risks. We need you back in one piece. Reyes nodded, his expression grim but resolute. We'll give them hell. You just make sure you get inside. The shuttle's thrusters roared as it approached the Stronghold's perimeter, its movements swift and precise. The Void's defenses reacted immediately, their turrets swiveling to lock onto the intruder. Team 1 launched, their small, agile vessels darting through the debris field as they drew the enemy's fire. The Stronghold's shields flickered as the diversion began, their energy fields weakening under the relentless assault. Mara watched from the shuttle, her heart pounding as Team 2 prepared to infiltrate. The moment the shields faltered, she gave the order, "Go." The shuttle surged forward, its thrusters screaming as it breached the Stronghold's defenses. The infiltration team moved quickly, their movements precise as they carved a path through the enemy's ranks. The corridors were dark and foreboding, their walls pulsing with an eerie green light. The hum of void energy was deafening, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. As they reached the central chamber, Mara's scanner beeped frantically, its readings erratic as it detected the Stronghold's core. The massive structure pulsed with energy, its green light casting long shadows across the room. Mara's hands flew across the interface, her fingers working quickly to plant the charges. The timer began to count down, its soft beep a stark contrast to the chaos around them. But before they could retreat, the room shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in flowing black robes, its mask absorbing the light around it. "The Harbinger, you cannot win," it said, its voice a low, resonant hum that reverberated in Mara's chest. "The void is eternal. Your efforts are futile." Mara's jaw tightened as she turned to face the Harbinger, her pulse rifle raised. "We'll see about that." The fight for survival had reached its climax. And as the void closed in, Mara knew one thing for certain: they weren't going down without a fight. The shuttle shuddered violently as it breached the Stronghold's outer defenses, the sound of rending metal and crackling energy shields filling the air. Mara gripped her pulse rifle tightly, her breath steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. The infiltration team moved swiftly, their movements precise as they carved a path through the dark, pulsating corridors of the Void's fortress. The walls seemed alive, their surfaces shimmering with an eerie green light that cast long, shifting shadows. The hum of void energy was deafening, a constant reminder of the enemy's presence. "Stay sharp," Mara warned, her voice cutting through the noise. "We don't know what's waiting for us in there." The team pressed forward, their weapons raised as they navigated the labyrinthine structure. The first wave of drones appeared without warning, their sleek, insect-like forms surging from the shadows. The air was thick with the sharp crack of plasma fire as the team fought back, their movements fueled by desperation and determination. The drones fell in waves, but for every one they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. "They're adapting," Reyes shouted over the comms, his voice strained as he fired another burst of plasma. "They're learning our patterns." Mara's jaw tightened as she processed his words. The drones were faster, smarter, their movements unnervingly precise. They flanked, they strategized, their glowing green eyes scanning the team with an almost predatory intelligence. It was clear now, the void wasn't just evolving. It was becoming something far more dangerous. "Keep moving," Mara ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. "We're not stopping until we reach the core." The team fought their way through the relentless waves of drones, their progress slow but steady. The corridors seemed endless, the Stronghold's defenses growing more formidable with every step. But they couldn't afford to falter. The fate of humanity depended on their success. Finally, they reached the central chamber, a massive, cavernous space dominated by the Stronghold's core. The structure pulsed with energy, its green light casting long shadows across the room. Mara's scanner beeped frantically, its readings erratic as it detected the core's unstable energy field. "This is it," Mara said, her voice steady but laced with quiet resolve. "We plant the charges and get out. No detours, no heroics." The team moved quickly, their movements precise as they set the charges. The timer began to count down, its soft beep a stark contrast to the chaos around them. But before they could retreat, the room shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in flowing black robes, its mask absorbing the light around it. "The Harbinger, you cannot destroy us," it said, its voice a low, resonant hum that reverberated in Mara's chest. "We are eternal." Mara's jaw tightened as she turned to face the Harbinger, her pulse rifle raised. "We'll see about that." The core began to destabilize, its energy field fluctuating wildly as the charges ticked down. The Stronghold shuddered violently, the walls groaning under the strain. The team fought their way back to the shuttle, their movements frantic as they carved a path through the relentless waves of drones. As the shuttle launched, the Stronghold erupted in a blinding flash of light, its core collapsing in a wave of searing energy. The shockwave rocked the shuttle, its thrusters screaming as it struggled to stabilize. Mara glanced back at the explosion, her breath catching in her throat. The Harbinger was gone, but the fight wasn't over. The Void's threat remained a reminder that the war for survival was far from over, and as long as they drew breath, they would keep fighting. The shuttle streaked toward the outpost, its tiny light a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. The Stronghold was destroyed, but the Void's evolution posed a new, more dangerous threat. And as Mara stared out into the void, she knew one thing for certain: they would need to evolve too if they were going to stand a chance. The fight for survival had entered a new phase, and the stakes had never been higher. But as long as they stood together, they had a chance, and that was enough. The shuttle's thrusters roared as it surged away from the collapsing Stronghold, the blinding flash of the core's destruction illuminating the void like a dying star. Mara gripped the controls, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Behind her, the Stronghold's massive structure began to crumble, its jagged walls folding inward as the chain reaction she had triggered tore through its core. The shockwave rippled outward, sending debris spiraling into the darkness. For a moment, the void was alive with light and fury, a testament to the power they had unleashed. But even as the Stronghold disintegrated, Mara couldn't shake the Harbinger's final words. They echoed in her mind, a cold, hollow reminder of the enemy they had fought so hard to destroy. "You've only delayed the inevitable." The words lingered, a chilling prophecy that cut deeper than any physical wound. The void wasn't just a force of destruction. It was a relentless, adaptive enemy, one that thrived on chaos and evolution. Mara had seen it firsthand, the way their drones had grown smarter, faster, more coordinated. Destroying the Stronghold was a victory, but it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. As the shuttle stabilized and the outpost's lights came into view, Mara exhaled sharply, her breath fogging the visor of her helmet. The survivors aboard the shuttle were silent, their faces pale but resolute. They had done the impossible, striking a crippling blow against the void, but the cost had been steep. The Stronghold's defenses had been overwhelming, its drones relentless. And now, as the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of their losses pressed down on them. Mara turned to Reyes, who sat in the co-pilot's seat, his expression grim. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with quiet pride. "We took down their heart." Mara nodded, her gaze drifting back to the wreckage of the Stronghold. "For now," she replied, her tone somber. "But the void isn't gone. Not really. They'll adapt, they'll rebuild, and when they do, they'll come back stronger." The shuttle docked with the outpost, its hatch hissing open to reveal the survivors gathered in the command center. They erupted into cheers as Mara and her team stepped inside, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. But Mara's expression remained solemn, her mind already racing with the implications of the Harbinger's warning. She moved to the holographic display, her hands flying across the interface as she pulled up the date they had gathered from the Stronghold. The Void's evolution wasn't just a threat, it was a call to action. They couldn't afford to rest, not even for a moment. "This isn't over," Mara said, her voice carrying across the room. "The Void will adapt, and so will we. We've got the data, the knowledge, the tools to fight back, but we need to be smarter, faster, stronger, because if we're not, they'll outpace us. And next time, we might not be so lucky." The survivors nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. As the outpost buzzed with renewed activity, Mara stepped outside, her gaze fixed on the stars. The Void's final words still echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the stakes. But amidst the fear, there was a flicker of hope. They had struck a blow against the enemy, and they would do it again. For now, they had won, but the war for survival was far from over. And as long as they stood together, they would keep fighting not just to survive, but to ensure that the Void's inevitable return was met with an even greater force. Humanity's survival depended on it. The shuttle's engines hummed faintly in the background, a steady reminder of the battles they had fought and the ones still to come. Mara took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. The Void had warned her of the inevitable, but they had underestimated humanity's resilience. And that was a mistake they would regret. The shuttle touched down on the outpost's landing pad, its thrusters sputtering as the engines powered down. The survivors emerged one by one, their faces etched with exhaustion, but lit by the faint glow of triumph. The mission had been a success. The Void's stronghold was destroyed. Their relentless enemy dealt a crippling blow. Yet, as Mara stepped onto the platform, the weight of their victory felt heavy, tinged with the cost of what they had lost. The outpost buzzed with activity, the survivors working tirelessly to repair the damage from previous battles. The air was thick with the hum of machinery and the rhythmic clang of tools, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet solemnity. They had fought the impossible and won, but the price had been steep. Friends, comrades, loved ones, so many had fallen along the way. Mara stood at the edge of the platform, her gaze sweeping over the outpost. The scars of war were everywhere: cracked walls, scorched metal, and makeshift repairs that barely held together. Yet, amidst the wreckage, there was a spark of life, a determination to rebuild. She took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and turned to the survivors gathered around her. "We've paid a heavy price," she began, her voice steady but laced with quiet emotion. "More than we could have imagined, but we've earned our future. Every loss, every sacrifice, it was for this moment. For the chance to rebuild, to carry on." The survivors listened in silence, their faces a mix of grief and resolve. They had been through hell together, fought side by side against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. And now, standing amidst the wreckage of their home, they were faced with a new challenge, not just to survive, but to thrive. Mara stepped forward, her tone softening but losing none of its strength. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone we've lost, everyone who fought to give us this chance. We owe it to them to make this count, to build something stronger, something that will endure. The survivors nodded, their movements fueled by a fragile but growing sense of hope. They began to work, their hands calloused and their spirits weary but unbroken. The outpost slowly transformed, its battered walls reinforced, its systems brought back online. It was a painstaking process, every repair a reminder of the battles they had fought and the ones still to come. As Mara walked through the outpost, she couldn't help but reflect on their journey. The road had been long and brutal, filled with moments of despair and triumph. They had faced the void head-on, stared into the abyss, and emerged victorious. But the fight wasn't over. The void's final words still echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that their enemy was far from defeated. "We've come so far," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the stars. "But this is just the beginning. The void will adapt, and so will we." The survivors worked through the night, their movements fueled by a quiet determination. The outpost was more than just a refuge. It was a symbol of their resilience. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Mara allowed herself a faint smile. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. And as long as they stood together, they would keep fighting, not just to survive, but to ensure that the sacrifices of the past were not in vain. The outpost buzzed with renewed energy, its lights flickering to life as the survivors continued their work. The fight for survival had entered a new phase, and the stakes had never been higher. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, humanity could endure, and for now, that was enough. The outpost buzzed with renewed life, its corridors no longer echoing with the hollow silence of loss, but filled with the hum of activity and purpose. The scars of war remained: cracked walls, patched hulls, and the faint glow of makeshift repairs, but they were no longer symbols of defeat. They were testaments to resilience, reminders of what they had survived and what they had built in the face of annihilation. Mara stood at the heart of it all, her gaze sweeping over the survivors as they worked tirelessly to restore what had been broken. The Stronghold's destruction had been a turning point, a blow against the void that had given humanity a fragile but vital reprieve. Yet Mara knew better than to mistake this victory for an end. The void was not gone, not truly. They were out there, silent and patient, waiting to adapt, to evolve, to strike again. But for now, the outpost thrived, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving void. The survivors moved with purpose, their hands callous but steady as they reinforced the station's defenses, repaired its systems, and scoured the surrounding space for resources. The air was thick with the scent of welding torches and the rhythmic clang of metal against metal. Children, once silent and fearful, now played in the corridors, their laughter a fragile but persistent melody that spoke of a future worth fighting for. Mara watched them, her expression softening for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her lungs as she stood on the observation deck. The stars stretched out before her, infinite and indifferent, their light a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. Her hand brushed against the worn edge of the railing, her fingers tracing the faint grooves left by years of wear. "For Kael," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the station. "For Jax, for all of us." The names carried weight, each one a story, a sacrifice, a piece of the fight that had brought them here. "Kael," whose unwavering resolve had kept them going when all seemed lost. Jack's, whose fierce loyalty had given them the strength to strike back. And so many others, their faces etched in her memory, their lives a testament to the cost of survival. As she turned to leave, a faint flicker caught her eye, a signal, weak but unmistakable, pulsing in the void. Mara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The scanner on her wrist beeped softly, its readings erratic but clear. A signal. From where? From who? Her mind raced as she stepped back into the command center, the holographic display flickering to life as she input the coordinates. The signal was faint, its origin unclear, but it was there. A whisper in the darkness, a call from the unknown. The survivors gathered around her, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What is it?" Reyes asked, his voice low but filled with quiet intensity. Mara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the display. "A signal," she replied, her tone steady but laced with uncertainty. "It's not void, it's something else." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. A signal meant possibility, a chance to connect, to rebuild, to find others who had survived the void's relentless advance. But it also meant risk. The void was not the only threat in the void, and the signal's origin was a mystery. Mara's jaw tightened as she made her decision. "We'll investigate," she said, her voice carrying across the room, but cautiously. "We've come too far to throw it all away now." The survivors nodded, their movements fueled by a fragile but growing sense of hope. The signal was a reminder that they were not alone, that somewhere out there, others were fighting the same fight. As the outpost buzzed with renewed energy, Mara turned back to the stars, her resolve hardening. The fight for survival had entered a new phase, one filled with uncertainty, but also possibility. The void's threat remained, but so did humanity's resilience. And as long as they stood together, they would endure. The signal flickered faintly in the void, a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. It was a call, a challenge, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But for now, the outpost thrived, and humanity began to reclaim the stars. Mara's voice was a whisper, her words carrying the weight of the past and the promise of the future. "For Kael, for Jax, for all of us, we will endure." And as the signal pulsed in the void, the horizon stretched out before them, vast, unknowable, and filled with possibilities.